One of the activities in conjunction with this wonderful celebration of ERISA's 50th anniversary would be to do a few projects together. It's just our honor to be part of the EBRI Policy Forum, which, as you all know, is always an extraordinarily important and valuable program. So I just want to say thank you, and thank you to Barb and her tremendous team. It's been a lot of fun working together and developing the program, but I'm sure that you will find interesting and informative, and we just want to say thanks.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Employee Benefit Research Institute's 93rd Policy Forum. While this is EBRI's 93rd Policy Forum, it's only my second and the first ever that we've done with American Benefits Council. We're very happy to be partnering with the council on this event. It's really been a great partnership, as Jim said, and I personally am proud and humbled to be partnering with Jim Klein, one of Washingtonians' 500 most influential people shaping policy of 2023. I just learned that this morning, by the way. Someone came over at breakfast and congratulated Jim. I was like, what? What was that about? So now I know. I joined EBRI as CEO a month before last year's 2023 May Policy Forum. At that point, the agenda was well set, everything was planned, and all I had to do was walk in and host the event. I remember thinking, wow, that was easy. Now, having planned 2 EBRI events, the first, our symposium earlier this year, I realized nothing's easy about it. So I want to sincerely thank both the EBRI team and the ABC team for all of their efforts to organize this year's Policy Forum. And as always, I want to thank the EBRI board and executive committee led by Chair Sandy McCarthy for all of your dedication and support to EBRI. I felt that support from the moment I joined. And importantly, as Jim said, we're very happy to be part of several events this year that are recognizing the 50th anniversary of ERISA. We have a great day planned. At today's forum, you'll hear both a historical perspective and current views on how ERISA protects the rights of plan participants while also allowing for the evolution of employer-provided benefits. And EBRI, I know you're on the edge of your seat, we will be unveiling some new research today, both health and wealth research related to ERISA, both to be followed by panel discussions of how plan sponsors and other key stakeholders, how they're relating to that research. So we're excited to share that with you. So I want to move on and get started on the agenda. And I'm very, very excited to be introducing our keynote speaker, Bob Johnson. Let me tell you just a little bit about Bob in case you don't know. I'm sure most of you know Bob. Bob is founder and chairman of RLJ Companies, an innovative business network that provides strategic investments in a diverse portfolio of companies. Bob was named by USA Today as one of the 25 most influential business leaders of the past 25 years. Sorry, Jim, I think that trumps you. Founder and former chairman of Black Entertainment Television, the nation's first Black-owned cable TV network. Number 2 on Black Enterprise's list of Titans, the 40 most powerful African Americans in business 40th anniversary issue. A frequent CNBC contributor, and very close to home and important to both EBRI and ABC, Bob is the chair of the Retirement Clearinghouse. So with that, I'd like to have Bob come up and he'll share some remarks, and then we'll have some time for Q&A as well. So thank you all for being here. It's going to be a great day.
Barbara, thank you for that wonderful introduction. And as my good friend Bill Clinton was reportedly to have said, flattery won't hurt you as long as you don't inhale it. So some of you remember that. But I'm delighted to be here to talk to you about my journey into retirement clearinghouse and auto portability and the portability services network. But I'm not going to talk about the process of the technology or the innovation. I'll let Spencer do that. I'm going to try to share with you my journey into this retirement space and why I believe so strongly in the importance of this to low-wage workers, with particular emphasis on African Americans and women. Um, the way I look at what we do is fairly simple, and so you guys understand it, is the key to auto portability, the key to long-term retirement health for 401k account holders and the companies that provide it, and the fund managers who manage it, is it's fairly simple. You keep it in the system and you let the magical elixir of compounding do its job. And if you do that, then retirement becomes a meaningful opportunity for millions of people who are underserved and in need of retirement security. So how I got into this, I've been in business, and one of the key ingredients that made me successful in business is that I have been fortunate to get to know people who believe in entrepreneurs and want to back them and give them support to achieve what they have as a vision and an opportunity. For me, the first person was a gentleman by the name of John Malone. John Malone is a multimedia billionaire who's got his start in the cable industry, helped build the cable industry, and now is within every aspect of communications, telecommunications, and everything else. And he met me as I was serving as a lobbyist for the cable television industry when the industry was in its infancy and they were just beginning to deliver basic cable channels to add to the over-the-air television channels. And John met me, he was on the board, and said, "Bob, if you ever have an idea, come talk to me." And I said, "Okay." And John lived in Denver, and I flew out to Denver with the idea of starting BET, Black Entertainment Television. Again, this is another example of what I call trying to reach out and do something innovative. And what I believe in is a business solution to a social problem. If you want to ask me what's your sort of moniker as to why you do things, I'm a firm believer that particularly if you're going to impact things like the huge wealth gap that exists between Black American families, households, and white American households, I'm not a big promoter of social handouts. I'm not a big promoter of transfer payments to solve the problem. I'm more of a believer in you give minority Americans and women the opportunity to achieve for themselves, for their family, for their community. 9 out of 10 times, they're going to take you up on that opportunity and put their best effort to make it work. So I found in John Malone a similar person who believed in entrepreneurs, he believed in merit. And if you had an idea that he thought was relevant and it related to something he believed in, he would back you. So I had the idea of starting Black Entertainment Television. It wasn't that I sort of invented the idea that Black programming needed to be on television, that Blacks needed more information, that focused on their issues, more content, so on. There were others who did it. The famous John Johnson, who created Ebony magazine, Jet magazine, basically created a magazine empire chronicling the rise of the Black middle class and convinced advertisers that these consumers and readers, given an opportunity, would buy their products and so on. And the same can be said of Black radio, music that was targeted to Black listeners, found its way on Black radio. Essence magazine, was an example for Black women. So it was not so much my idea that I said Blacks need content or Black needs information. It was just, how do you do it with a technological innovation? Well, cable spread throughout the country with the launch of a geostationary satellite that allows you to beam a signal up to a satellite and beam it back down to cable disc and head in, dishes and head in all across the country, creating the ability to provide a huge amount of diversity of content. And of course, BET was part of that, MTV, ESPN, CNN, and all the cable channels you know today. So I go out to John Malone and I told him about the idea. He had cable systems. I had an idea of cable programming. So John asked me, he said, Bob, how much is it going to take you to start this thing called BET? I said, John, it's going to take me $500,000. Now, keep in mind, this is 1980, sometime around that time. $500,000 to start BET, a lot less than it take me to start Retirement Clearinghouse, Spencer. So he said, okay, and this took 30 minutes. It shows you what kind of entrepreneurial guy John is. He said, how much you need? I said, $500,000. He said, Bob, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to buy 20% of your company for $180,000, and I'm going to loan you $320,000. That's your $500,000. I said, yeah. And he said, Bob, under that plan, here's what you will be 80% owner and I will be 20. Is that a deal? I said, John, that's a deal. What John Malone didn't know at that time, if he'd reversed the numbers and said, I'll be 80 and you'll be 20, I would say, John, that's a deal. So I walk out of there with $500,000. Now, keep in mind a little bit about what Barbara didn't say about my background. I grew up in a small town, well, born in Mississippi, moved with my folks with the migration of Black folks during World War II. Moved to a small town in Illinois, northern Illinois, called Freeport, Illinois. And that's where I sort of got my start. Freeport's a town of about 30,000 people, 10% Black. The famous part about Freeport, for those of you who are history students, Freeport was one of the famous sites of the Lincoln-Douglas debate. It also was the boyhood home of Spencer Tracy. And also Hedda Hopper hung out in Freeport when she was little. And then you got me. So you got a pretty good group of people in Freeport. So, but to me, when keep in mind, I was 9 of 10. And John Malone, after we closed the deal, 80-20, I got 80, he got 20. He gives me a check for $500,000. Now, to me, $500,000 is equal to the entire GDP of every Black person in Freeport. And you talk about somebody terrified that something's going to happen to me when I got that $500,000 check. I'm saying, I got to fly back. Oh, I know the plane's going to crash. Something's going to happen to me. This is not going to work. So I get the money and I'm getting ready to leave. We're going to ask John a question. I was afraid to, so I made sure he wrote me a little contract, took all of 30 minutes, gave me a contract, giving me a check for $500,000. So now I was smart enough to get the check first before asking this question. I said, John, I've never run a business, but by that time I had the check. So I got the check now. I said, John, what advice can you give me? He said, Bob, this is really simple. Get your revenues up, keep your costs down. Same thing I tell Spencer too. Get your revenues up, keep your costs down. But that to me was someone saying to me, I'm going to trust you. I'm going to put confidence in you. Here's a white cable operator living in Colorado who see me, small town kid from Freeport, born in Mississippi, say, I'm going to believe in you. I'm going to believe in your idea of innovation of this channel. I'm going to believe in your idea that you're going to put as much work in this as I would expect you to do. And so it was that I tell you that story because that's where I became found myself in a position to look at another innovation idea that went directly to what I thought was a definite need of how you address the huge wealth gap between Black and white Americans. And so to me, it was that deal with John Malone, which led me to create Black Entertainment Television, sell it and make a significant amount of money, and have the capital to invest in the idea of how can we save wealth for Black Americans in retirement without going to the government to say, government, you do it, without any kind of obligation on the part of African Americans to do their part, which is work and save money in a 401k account, which I didn't know much about. I later found out about it through Spencer. So to me, the idea was, is there what I said earlier, a business solution to a social problem? Social problem, the way I looked at it, like this. The average white American household has a 10 to 12 times gap in the wealth differential between that of an average Black household. So let's assume that the average Black household has a net worth of $25,000, $30,000. That means the average white household has a net worth of $250,000 or $300,000. Now, you want to know what causes a crisis of fear about your future, a crisis of concern about your present? It's not knowing how you can survive when you face an economic crisis, an economic risk. And what that does is it causes Black Americans to do certain things economically that they probably shouldn't do because they don't have security in the form of wealth, which translates into investments and savings. And of course, obviously, an economic opportunity for a job. So I looked at that and I said, how can I solve this without going to government programs and subsidies and transfers and and so on? Because I didn't believe that. And for that same reason, although I understand why Black Americans talk, and some white Americans and some governments talk about reparations. Reparations is really not designed to put wealth in your hands for generations to come. Wealth reparations really is, you want to call it a payment for a, I guess you would best describe it as a treatment that deprive you of certain rights. And that's the right to accumulate wealth, the right to accumulate savings, the right to have a job, the right. But it's not going to, in my opinion, solve the problem, because just really simple in my mind, and you can quote me on this, it will never happen. There will be no universal reparations program for Black Americans. There won't be one statewide, citywide, because mostly white Americans don't buy into the notion that they owe a debt to people who hundreds, 300 plus years ago were slaves, and following slavery discriminated against, and following discrimination, lack of economic opportunity, whether it's education, whether it's jobs, whether it's ownership of certain government assets, and so on. So it's not going to happen. So my thing was, how do I address the huge wealth gap? How do I address the need to have Black Americans accumulate wealth? And how do I address the need for white Americans to say, we can support a program that provides a business solution to a social problem? So just as I met John Malone, I meet Spencer. Spencer has an innovative idea, except Spencer didn't have any money like John did. I had the money. So Spencer told me, Bob, there's a way to help improve wealth and savings of Black American families. I said, how do you do that? He said, there's this problem that happens when people change jobs. And I said, well, what's that? Black Americans cash out. And they lose what I call the magic elixir of compounding. And they don't have the savings when they retire. Now, I understood a little bit about that once he explained it to me. I said, aha, I get this. Because remember now, I was running BET. And BET had a lot of Black people working for it, as you can imagine. And so what happened is I said, gee, I got to do something to help my workers. So what I would do, it was my own version of my own 401k account. It wasn't a 401k account. It was sort of like I'll help you fund. Here's what we would do. We say, look, I know all of you guys are good workers. I know I want you to be around here a long time. But if you have a need for something, and I sort of tailored it as an emergency need or an important need at least, I say, you come to me and say, you need $1. I'll give you 50 cents on that dollar to help you do something that's a need. But it has to be, keep in mind, I wasn't doing this with a legal term. We weren't at an HR program. It was me and them. And I said, here's what you should do. Just come to me. Tell me you got a family crisis. Tell me you got your roof leaks. Tell me you need money for your mother. She said, and we'll do it because I know you're going to be it. And you'll pay us back over time. And we started doing that. And some of the people would say, come to me, Mr. Johnson, my mother is sick. She's got to get some medical help. And I need, $200. Can you give me another $100? It's 50% ratio. I said, yeah, Joe, Mary, you worked here a long time, expect you to be along. Sure, we do it. It was going along pretty good as a program until all of a sudden I start hearing from the senior executives who work for me, Bob, people are coming and asking me, can you help them go to the Howard University homecoming? I said, they want $200 to go to homecoming. They need another $100 to stay at a hotel. I said, I'm not sure that's what the program was intended for. And they would say, well, I'm going to pay you back. I got a great job. And, this is my first year. I just graduated from Howard. I want to go back to homecoming. And when I started to realize that's not the program I had in mind, but I understood the need and desire for people to have things that they wanted and that they couldn't afford. Ergo, cash outs. And then I sort of challenged Spencer. Spencer, find out what we can do to eliminate the cash outs. And Spencer worked at Mass Mutual. And so he knew something about the retirement service. And he told me two things. That's the only thing you can go to that can solve this. You've got to get the retirement industry to embrace this notion. I said, okay. And then I said, well, what's the problem? He said, they move as slow as ever. And I said, it can't be that slow. He said, slow as ever. So this is, I'm doing this, going on this ride with Spencer. Little did I know, 10 years later, he was absolutely telling the truth. So the first thing I said, Spencer, what does the government have to do with this? He said, government's got to give us approve certain regulations, certain exemptions on our ability to do this, authorize us to do it, authorize to have certain sort of ways to enforce the idea of ending cash outs. And I say, well, how do you get that done? He said, Bob, simple. All you got to do is get somebody in the government to write you a letter. I said, you mean there's just a letter that somebody can sign and I can keep black folks from cashing out? He said, yep. 10 years ago, I went to 3 administrations, Obama, Trump, Biden, to get the government to see this, now when I think of it, simple solution to solve a social problem. That is the lack of retirement savings for Black Americans. And as I got into this and started thinking about it, how do you shrink the wealth gap? How do you eliminate the, I'll call it the myth, maybe it's a myth for a good cause or a good belief, that there's one day there's going to be reparations and close the wealth gap for Black Americans. And something that did not require transfer payments from taxpayers who didn't want to pay in the first place. It is to change the mindset, come up with an innovative solution that simply said, we're going to make things that you think are hard, things that you think are complex, you being the employee, you being the employer, you being the government, and just make this work by giving people an option to save for their own financial security and their own financial future. And we would begin to close the savings gap. And if you can close the savings gap, you're on the road to closing the wealth gap. Because with savings, the magical thing about savings, I said, if you put it someplace that's managed, and it's managed in a way that compounds the wealth, the odds are not only will you save what you get in your work life, you have a saving mentality in your existing life and start looking at how you consume. When I happened to go to graduate school at the Woodrow Wilson School of Princeton, and I'll never forget this term. I was in this class, and this professor of economics, it was a macroeconomics class. And we got to talking about consumption. And somehow he said the problem of debt accumulation. And he said that Black Americans as a whole have the highest marginal propensity to consume. And I said, what does that mean? He said, they have a lot of debt. And they have a lot of debt because they can't afford to save or have not been introduced to the benefits of saving and haven't focused on how savings can change their economic condition. And so when I think of 401k Audibility and the Portability Service Network and the companies that have come to this to be a part of this, is they're basically saying, we can find a business solution to a social problem. And we've done it in a way that has almost, and I applaud this to the Portability Services Network partners, the 6 partners in this. We decided from day one that it would be run like a utility. Try to find the lowest cost methodology of providing the maximum benefit to low wage workers. So when you think of what we can do as we grow Portability Services Network 200 and plus billion dollars begin to stay in the system and therefore in the hands of minority and low wage workers. And the same thing can be said if later on we're able to get the savers match to follow that methodology. And so when I look at it and I look at something I've done, and now believe me, I understand reparations. In fact, if some of you go online, you can say Bob Johnson did a study on reparations. I did. It was a simple process. I came up with a model that I did with some help. It was not totally scientific, but it made sense. Sort of the old saying, clear as mud, but it covered the ground. And so I came up with a number, and I'll give you that number: $14 trillion. And the idea was how I reset number. I said, what I want to do is I want to make every Black person in America as rich and wealth as the average white American. So that meant I had to take Black household spread, make it equal. White household, 60%, Black household, 37%. I got to now bring that up. Now, how much does that cost? I got to do it in employment job payment. I got to bring that up. How much does that cost? And all of these factors that make the spread, I had to figure out a way to bring it up. And I realized that the only way that would work is you'd go to everybody who had 14 trillion and ask them to give it to the people who did have it. Not going to happen. Particularly when you say all Blacks, whose parents and generations ago were slaves. So one day, the poorest Black guy in America walks up and he says, here's your $100,000. You say, oh, that's fair. Then the next person to walk up is Michael Jordan. Michael Jordan, here's your $100,000. You're Black. And then Bob Johnson, here's yours is Black. And Magic Johnson, yours is Black. All of a sudden, people say, I'm not giving Michael Jordan $100,000. I'm not giving Bob Johnson $100,000. Ergo, not going to happen. So what my appeal here is, let's think of this. Our goal is to close a wealth gap that gives confidence and security to people who wake up every day feeling insecure. Because any day, I'm a single mom, 3 kids, and the refrigerator goes out. That's fear. That's insecurity. What do they have to do when they're living paycheck to paycheck? And don't even mention what happens when you're retirement, when you're the son and a daughter of a mother or a father who gets Alzheimer's disease and needs in-home nursing care. No way in the world can you pay that if you have no savings and you are totally facing a problem. You know what you do? Unfortunately, sometimes you run down to a payday lender. And you know what a payday lender does? Charges you 60, 70% for your own money. That to me is why retirement is such an important, I guess I would call it an important device, system, plan with a touch of morality in it, a touch of a commitment to give people a chance to care for themselves. And that's what I want. That's why I put money behind Spencer and his innovation. That's why I went up and down Capitol Hill to members of the House and the Senate. That's why I end up talking to every White House administration that would listen. And that's why it took us 10 years from the moment we conceived of this to get it now where the largest managers of 401k accounts have sort of put aside a competitive set that normally exists with among these businesses and said, we're going to trade not only technology, we're going to trade data in a way that we are confident the end result will be for a common good. And that's why I'm so excited about Retirement Hero Class. That's why I'm excited about the opportunity to talk to you. And we will need your help when we get to, I don't know, the 25, 26, when they begin to try to implement the Savers Match. Because one of the things you got to do, again, you got to convince some naysayers, or my worst fear is when the government wants to do it all without having a public-private partnership. I would prefer to have business do it rather than the government. So thank you very much. And I will be glad to take any questions that you have.
Hi, thank you very much for, I'll stand up. So you can see. Thank you very much for speaking with us today. It's really inspiring story. I'm curious about Secure 2.0 and the lost and found. That's one of the provisions in there, which hasn't been implemented yet, I don't think, but basically the idea is to have a lost and found for any accounts that disappear. And this happens. I mean, I teach financial literacy classes and some of the folks are like, yeah, I had a retirement account 20 years ago. I have no idea where it went. Does that impact your business at all? Is that good news, bad news? Can you incorporate that into what you're doing?
I'm going to give you the answer to that question by telling you a quick story. One of the things that's made me successful, I have been very good at getting people like John Malone to help me get in business and be successful. I'm therefore was able to become the first African-American billionaire because I met John Malone. I'm also the largest owner of black-owned dealership of car dealerships because I was fortunate enough to meet a guy named Matt McClarity, who was Bill Clinton's chief of staff. And now I'm the largest owner of the Portability Service Network thing because I met a guy named Spencer. Three things about these guys. They're all good white guys. Spencer, come up and tell them what the answer to that question is.
I was afraid of the technical questions. Bob, your story is amazing. And I've had the privilege of literally, 10 years daily contact with Bob. And I've seldom met people in my life that just stick to something. When I told him, he remembers this story. I said, this is going to take 5 to 10 years, Bob. He's like, are you serious? Type of thing. So the answer is the Portability Services Network has a role to play in the lost and found. I don't know what the full solution is, but I'm going to give you a picture. All right. At full throttle, okay, everybody's on board, for auto portability and accounts are moving around the system seamlessly. That's one function. The second function is you created a virtual database of all the 401k account holders in the country. And their address of record is with their current employer. So if you want to solve the missing participant problem, first, move old accounts so that they're always current. And second, take advantage of that 80+ million member database of the second best data on the planet. The best data on the planet is when a participant actually gives us their address. Nobody does that, right? So the answer is the Portability Services Network and its utility function has multiple purposes. So there's the technical.
Told you, Kelly. Yes.
Hi, great presentation. There was some reference to financial literacy in the prior question, and it always seemed to me that financial literacy is a major problem in this country. It's a major problem among whites. It's probably a greater problem among blacks. Do you have any thoughts about how to address the financial literacy issue? Because that's part and parcel of trying to solve the retirement problem.
Yeah, my idea, again, I have these ideas that I throw up and sometimes I carry them out, sometimes I don't. I was at a conference where it was a presentation by the top guys who are involved in the creation of AI. And also on that panel, that group were people involved in games, not football game, but games, the kind of games that people play. If I were in charge of making a decision like that, I would make every school require them to create the kind of compelling games that kids play, whether they war game, whatever they play. Teach them how that can be turned into a game. And if they are successful in winning points in those games, those points turn into dollars. It pays their way through college. And get people to invest in that pool of reward money. So every high school boy and girl, every kid would start playing those games like they play them now. I don't care whether they're NBA games or football games or warfare games or whatever you want to call them. Focus on things that they understand. Somebody says, I want to be a I want to be a record producer. All right, create a game about how you become a record producer. And that's something they like. So you meet them where they live, so to speak. And all of a sudden, they learn that being a record producer, you gotta have people to, write music. You gotta have audio studio to make the music. Money being spent. You understand how that works. The idea is it focuses on young people because as you get older and you basically, if you don't have the retirement and you don't, it's kind of hard to get literacy going. You got to get it done at that young age. And it's got to be an in-game reward, not just bingo, you won. But your parents need to know that, okay, he's playing this game. But if he plays this game, he's guaranteed that if he scores high enough a win, there's money over here for him or her to go to college. It's basically you're paying for something you believe in. You just don't have a way to transmit it to the recipients of what you believe in. That's the way I look at it.
Just a point of clarification. Lots of great points you brought up today. And cash outs are certainly a challenge. The clarification is, does the auto portability network solve cash outs? Is that
That's the fundamental objective of auto portability, is to have a system that follows your 401k wherever you go forever. And if assuming an average American changes jobs 10 times in their work life, you got your auto portability 401k just goes with you. The key is back to what the point you just raised. You got to add a level of savings to that outside of the 401k. Because that's not going to ever be, may not necessarily be enough for total retirement. But the simplicity was the primary goal. And out of simplicity will come an inducement to do what is in your best self-interest. So it has that component to it. It's got a little bit of I wouldn't call it an enforcement, but it does have a little bit of encouragement in the form of the right to move it if you don't move it yourself and you don't cash out. So, yeah, we believe in that kind of, and I wouldn't call it a negative option, but it's focused on that. Any other questions? Go ahead, question over here. Last one.
Just a comment more than a question, and thank you so much for your talk today. I think what we're talking about here is the need for behavior change. There's a lot of great work being done here. Automaticity has done wonders to help save people from themselves. But I think what's really, really important is infiltrating employees, American workers, through advisory services. So there's a lot of great work being done on this. I don't know if everyone's familiar with Yemi Rose and his organization Of Color, but they offer advisory services to employers to help solve this problem. It requires coaching. It requires outreach and education. Policy alone is not going to help. And I think there's just a lot more work that needs to be done. And I think everyone should check out Of Color. It's a really great organization. I don't work for them. I don't work with Yemi Rose, but I've had an opportunity to talk to them. And I think it's a really, really important additive in the meantime, while this policy work is continuing. So.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with you. We've thought, which I've thought about, I haven't sort of pushed it on the idea to the PSN group that we could become a brand that says, this is what you can do to induce people, motivate people to go down to their HR office and say, hey, I heard about this thing that's being run by this guy named Bob Johnson that's supposed to save money for Black folks. How do I get in it? I mean, however you want to describe it. We've thought about that as just becoming a nationwide brand, like savings is sort of like a cool thing to do or the smart thing to do in your life. Eventually we could get there, but right now we got a lot of regulations that probably would frown on that or prohibit that, or we may be too early in the queue to do that. But I think you're absolutely right. You're not going to cause people to start saving to save for what they need as to buying what they want. That's where I think you got to get. And that's not just Black Americans, white Americans too. It's just, you got to put more, people got to start thinking is consumption, material consumption without a savings plan is a game that's going to end badly. So thank you.
Thank you. I know that we're the junior partner in this program when Barb gets the privilege of introducing Bob Johnson, and I'm the one who has to pull him off the stage after that tremendous presentation, which was so informative and inspiring. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Our panel would come up now. Okay. 50 years of ERISA in 45 minutes. Let's get rolling. So the good thing about an illustrious panel like this is that they are well known in our benefits community. But for the folks who may not be familiar, Del Salisbury is the CEO Emeritus of EBRI and the founder of that organization back in 1978 was, right? Howard Fleur, Chairman Emeritus of Siegel Company and former chair of the board of EBRI. Phyllis Borsey, former Secretary of Labor for the Employee Benefit Security Administration during the Obama administration and a 16-year vet. Can folks hear me in the back? Okay, no. Thank you very much for joining us. And let's jump right into it. And we want to leave. And it's, I think this one's working better. Thank you. So gonna go back to pre-ERISA. And Howard, you were the only one, I think, involved in the world of employee benefits before 1974. And I'm just curious, you might take a moment to describe the Wild West of pre-ERISA. And more importantly, what do you think were some of the ills of the system that the law was intended to address?
Well, I think that
Technology will get you every time. Here comes another one.
I think it's the usual when you're in the Wild West, you don't realize it.
Can you juggle 3 of them at once?
And it was an interesting system in lowercase, but there was some government regulation. and there was a motivation to help people. That's where it came from. I switched from insurance companies after 5 years and went into consulting because I thought this whole pension thing might be interesting, and having had experience as a health actuary, it seemed like a good thing to do. The ills were, in some ways, more that people weren't covered. But then it was also because there wasn't enough motivation, except for some ancient companies. But there was also the issue of security. And I think many of you have heard about the famous Studebaker case. And although I think more people became familiar with Studebaker at that time than anybody who ever owned one. And that really brought it to the fore. And you can tell it brought it to the fore because there was a program on 60 Minutes about it, which led to hue and cry around. And I would say that ERISA was mostly well-motivated to provide protection and to some extent to encourage people, employers, to do something about it. And from the labor side, it was mixed as to what areas of organized labor were pro and what areas were against. But ultimately, through remarkable political ability of Jacob Javits and Harrison Williams, it actually came to pass. And our question was, is this good news or bad news for consultants? And the answer is yes.
And real quickly, who are the components of the labor union movement that was for it and against it?
Those who worked in, who were multi-employer plans, so the sponsors of multi-employer plans, generally were against it because they wanted to maintain their control and influence. And those like the auto workers, where they were industrial unions, were mostly in favor of it. And from the point of view of clout, it was mixed. But in general, employers, I think to their credit, and certainly those caring about the general population, really were, well, they were in a position because of 60 Minutes and some others, they really had no choice but to be supportive. And again, Javits was remarkably effective at getting it done. He was from an antediluvian thing called a Rockefeller Republican.
Thanks, Howard. So Dallas, I think you were at the Department of Justice in 1974, and then you got posted over to the Department of Labor. So this enormous new law had just been enacted, and now all of a sudden the executive branch agency is like, all right, now how do we implement and enforce it? What were some of the big picture issues that the agencies had to grapple with now that this law was law of the land?
Well, as noted, a major feature of ERISA was reporting and disclosure. And when Harvard professor John Dunlop became labor secretary, the first issue that was an ERISA issue that hit his desk is that the Labor Department had implemented in the first wave of ERISA something called the EBS-1. And the EBS-1 was sitting at the first filing, tens of thousands of them in boxcars on the railroad spare tracks at Union Station. And he was getting a tremendous amount of negative feedback from the House and the Senate members who said, we're getting all of our small businesses complaining to us about this new cost and administrative burden, but the government's doing nothing with it. Why are you wasting our money? And Dunlop immediately said to some of them, well, we will create a new agency. And so suddenly the position of responsibility for ERISA, which had been resting with the Assistant Secretary for the Labor Management Services Administration, became the first manifestation of a separate program. And a gentleman from the Justice Department, James Hutchinson, suddenly became the first administrator of this new program, end quotes. And so it was at that point Dunlop bringing in a dedicated political appointee to deal with ERISA, and the first action signed by that person, literally the day he arrived at the Labor Department, was a repeal of the EBS-1 form. And that made not only the secretary very happy, but it made many people on Capitol Hill very happy. then moved to the next critical regulatory area, the participation and vesting standards, because if you don't define participation, then fiduciary and other provisions are somewhat meaningless. The third priority was the fiduciary standards, which led to the initial version of the multi-part test, which was the rule of the day until, should we say, quite recently, after a number of attempts. So that was the main, and then the final major priority that was one of the responsibilities that actually I'd attended my first meeting related to ERISA before it was law in July of 1974. And it was a debate between the then Solicitor Bill Kilberg with the former Deputy Secretary of Labor and former Solicitor of Labor, who was then Deputy Attorney General, over which agency should have what type of enforcement authorities and ability. And the result of those ultimately was that the Labor Department began its investigation of the Teamsters Union Pension Fund. And so it moved into the enforcement as really the third major priority.
Thank you. Phyllis, you arrived on Capitol Hill in 1979. So I'm sure after 5 years of this law in the books, there were, either issues that hadn't been dealt with in the original law, or maybe issues that were emerging that hadn't been anticipated. And I'm sort of curious, what were the priorities of Congress in those early years? And maybe you would add a particular reflection, if you would. I mean, ERISA, employee benefits, is this amalgam of labor law and tax law. And so it's not surprising that from the beginning until the current day, there are competing committees of jurisdiction, tax committees, labor committees, and the executive branch as well. So how did some of those skirmishes play out?
It wasn't an easy set of times. I'll just say that. I was a law student when ERISA was passed, and I answered an ad on the bulletin board for a law student to work at a small consulting firm that had just been established by Steve Shanis, who was the first executive director of the PBGC and who had committed to spend 1 year setting up the PBGC. And then he thought he was going back to San Diego, where his wife and 5 children still were there. So I started, my first experience with ERISA was as a law student. My job was every day that I was at the office, I would go around to all the agencies, pick up their press releases, their compliance alerts, and I'd take all that technical jargon and put it into a newsletter that went to all of our clients. It was a wonderful experience for me. I met a person named Dallas Salisbury. I met a lot of people, several people that had worked on the Hill, not just for the Senate. Howard, you mentioned Senators Javits and Williams. On the House side, Congressman John Erlenborn, who was the ranking Republican on what was then the Ed and Workforce, and John Dent from Pennsylvania, were the 2 people on the House side that were involved. And in 1979, because of a complete fluke, i.e., I had some little experience with ERISA because of my student days, and I was willing to work cheap, which back then was the hallmark for getting a job on the Hill. In my later years, as I reflected on it, I didn't know anybody. I had no connections. I think it's hard probably now for people without connections to get jobs. But anyway, so I arrived on my first day of work on the Hill was February 2nd, 1979. Is there anybody in this audience who can tell me why that date was important?
It's Groundhog Day.
Well, it is Groundhog Day, but that wasn't the reason. It was the day that what ultimately became the Multi-Employer Pension Plan Amendments Act of 1980 was introduced. And I was hired to work on it. Now, did I know anything about multi-employer plans? Not really. But I was willing to work cheap, and I was at the right place at the right time. So the first priority in 1979, when I arrived, was to try to figure out what, if anything, Congress needed to do about the multi-employer program. For those of you who remember when ERISA was passed, because of the lobbying of the multi-employer plans, the termination insurance program was effective for single employer plans, but kept getting deferred for multi-employer plans. And the day of reckoning, people figured in 1979 was the day we better, roll up our sleeves and figure out what to do. That was my first experience with this multi-jurisdictional question. Title IV of ERISA came out of the labor committees. And so one would think that the labor committees would have sole, if not primary, jurisdiction over amendments to the to Title IV. However, the premiums in the next decade or so kept getting flipped from on budget to off budget, depending on when the Ways and Means Committee and Finance Committee needed extra revenue. So the tax committees weighed in jurisdictionally because they characterized the premium as a tax. And that's how we wound up with 4 committees of jurisdiction: the tax and labor committees and the tax and the Finance and Ways and Means Committee. So that was my first foray into the congressional jurisdiction. But the thing that sticks most in my mind, Jim, is the fight that we had when Congress began to fill in the gaps in healthcare, because the healthcare jurisdiction was even more muddled than the pension jurisdiction. The public programs, Medicare and Medicaid, were a constant struggle, jurisdictional struggle between, on the House side, the Ways and Means Committee and the Energy and Commerce Committee. And the loose division of labor, if you will, was that Medicare was Ways and Means. Medicaid was Energy and Commerce primarily, but with Ways and Means involved. So the first big healthcare bill that came through when I was there was the health insurance continuation provisions that were included in the 1985 COBRA reconciliation legislation. And there we were introduced, we had a rude awakening. The bill that was the forerunner of the COBRA provision was a joint bill by Ways and Means, Pete Stark, who chaired the Health Subcommittee at Ways and Means, and my then boss, Bill Clay, who chaired the Labor Management Relations Subcommittee at Ed and Labor. At some point during the process, the Energy and Commerce Committee decided to assert its jurisdiction, and they did so in a very creative way. It was clear that Energy and Commerce had jurisdiction over the business of insurance. They argued, however, that because health plans were an amalgam of self-insured, fully insured, hybrid, that the Energy and Commerce jurisdiction was not just the business of insurance, but when there was no insurance. Sort of an interestingly broad concept. And eventually it was worked out among the 3 committees. And so the 3 committees did it. So those were the 2 things.
Well, thanks. And you actually answered a question I was going to ask later on, and that is dispelling the myth that ERISA never was intended to cover health
well,
benefits.
that's a
The
bigger
word
myth.
retirement is in the law, but not the word health.
There are
So-
2 myths with respect to that. The first myth is the well-trafficked, but completely wrong myth that the framers of ERISA, the Javitzes, the Earl and Bournes, the Dents, the Williams, made a mistake. This was a drafting error. They never intended to cover health plans. That's absolutely false. They always did. What they did is, however, create a regulatory gap. And we all know that creating a vacuum means people move forward. So that's one myth. The second myth is a more recent myth, and that's with the recent transparency provisions that were part of the CAA. I've heard lots of speakers and read lots of articles where people say, wow, this is the first time that ERISA's fiduciary rules ever applied to health plans. Wrong. The fiduciary rules were there from the beginning and they apply to all benefit plans.
So you mentioned former Congressman, late Congressman John Erlenborn, one of the true authors of the law. And I remember him telling me many, many years ago, after he had left Congress, actually, that despite the fact that he was intimately involved in developing the law, when the concept of the Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation arose, that he almost walked away from the whole process because he was concerned with the moral hazard that employers and unions would negotiate and agree to benefits that they wouldn't be able to live up to. And so that sort of has spawned this ongoing debate in terms of whether the PBGC, is or should be a social insurance program or a more traditional risk insurance corporation. And so I'd like sort of all of your thoughts on that. And, did those who created the agency through the law, did they get it right with benefit of reflection? Should it perhaps have been structured differently?
Well, when I joined the PBGC, the study that was just being completed was a study related to what allowed PBGC to be included in ERISA, which was because of the issue and the debate between social and a risk-based insurance program. In order for it to pass, one of the last negotiations that Javits pushed into the system was a mandate for a contingent employer liability insurance program. And it was based on the conviction that the private insurance market would aggressively seek to make money out of essentially providing the insurance that was going to be PBGC. So PBGC itself would have to do nothing but put out regulations and work with these insurance carriers, and the private market would absorb all of the risk of the termination and funding or unfundedness based on premium payments. And the conclusion of the contingent employer liability insurance program, as I arrived, was finishing that and then became the director of the study that led to the Multi-Employer Pension Plan Amendments Act, is we had just completed the analysis of the letters that went to just over 100 insurance companies with a description of Title IV of ERISA, with a description of the objectives of the COLA program. And all of them said, we are totally uninterested. This is an uninsurable event. The agency then went to Lloyd's of London on the advice of a small firm in New York called Marsh & McLennan, the parent company of William Mercer, because they said, well, if anybody will underwrite this, Lloyd's of London will. Lloyd's of London looked at it and they came back to the agency and in a different set of words that were far more judicious, basically said, you got to be crazy. So
I
the
usually
report to
describe that
Congress,
have you lost your mind
Correct.
conversation.
so the report to Congress was, it's unworkable. This might just as well be allowed to lapse because it cannot happen. And so what had allowed Title IV to go into the act, which was this presumption that it would in fact be a risk-based program with no social component, went out the window. And that was part of, other than the congressional mandate, what ended up influencing the structure and the approach taken under MEPA and much of the future, the PBGC, because once that was gone, to your point, the assumption became, and all of the political pressure became, this is a social obligation, with the most recent evidence of that being enactment during the Biden administration of a rather large multi-billion-dollar, should we call it a bailout, of the multi-employer pension system, and huge flow of funds from the government into those programs, and definitely Now it is a social program. It has very little, if anything, to do with a risk assessment or anything any private insurance company would find doable.
Howard, your take on it?
Let me give you from another point of view. The actuarial profession at the time, which was really small and almost muted, had the view of, are you out of your minds? It's really not an insurable risk. It needs to be something like social insurance. But just a little more context. Prior to ERISA, actuaries were not regulated as far as the pension work. We did the work following the canons of the profession, but there was no legal issue. The Academy of Actuaries was created to go to deal with government issues as opposed to just education, and went to the federal government and said, anybody can call himself or herself an actuary. That's a dangerous thing. And given the nature of the government at the time, they said, no one knows and no one cares, forget it. So then when the ERISA was developed and it included regulation of actuaries, creating the whole issue of enrolled actuaries, the answer was, well, we have to do this because you can't trust the actuaries. Well, really, we told you we have a process, and said, well, nobody cares. And of course, they reversed it and said, why aren't we regulating you? So that's where enrolled actuaries came from. And the answer is, I'm number 113.
And a closing note, given that this is a co-sponsored event with EBRI, is within the first 10 of those policy forums were 2 policy forums related to the Pension Benefit Guarantee Corporation, and 2 of the earliest books published by EBRI related to the issue of, can this program be made workable?
Well, I just want to echo what my colleagues said. The fact is, at the time, I mean, Dallas is right that there was a perception, at least from some quarters, that this was a true risk-based insurance. But if so, it was devised by people who didn't understand risk. It was clearly a political response. And when I came to the first thing I was handed when I came to the committee was that Seeley report that Dallas just talked about. And it was clear from talking to the people, the staff and the members who were still around, who were conferees on ERISA, that there was a very divergent point of view as to what this was supposed to be. And there were certainly members of the tax committees that saw this more as a risk-based traditional insurance program. But the people that I worked with on the Labor Committee and also on the Senate Labor Committee had a very different point of view.
I would totally agree with that, except they never would have gotten the provision in the act in the absence of convincing Javits that this was doable. So I mean, it's an interesting.
I have no doubt that
But I totally agree with you that on the Labor Committee side, the major sentiment was this should be a pure social insurance program.
Yeah.
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 So this is really interesting. Thanks to all 3 of you on that. Let's shift for a moment, if we may, to defined contribution and the origins of the 401k. So Phyllis, I know you were up there at the time.
I was.
And
well, I was actually.
Well, that's true. You weren't there yet, but
just graduated.
But I think you attended the
Yes.
hearings anyway.
I had just graduated from law school, and the small consulting firm that I worked for still thought I was part of their employment structure, even though I was working for free. And I got a call one day and say, could you go over to the Ways and Means Committee? They're having these hearings, which on a bill that ultimately became the tax bill of 1978. And so I was sitting there in the audience when this question about cash or deferred salary reduction plans and the 401k amendments were offered by Barbara Conable, who was, I think, the ranking Republican at the time. He was from state New York, Rochester. Kodak was closer. Kodak and Xerox were two big constituents, and they both had problems, questions as to whether or not they could do salary reduction, employee contributions to these plans.
Yeah, arguably, and I mean, this is literally, I was emailed this morning, so I was reading it early, is because I remember we had talked on the phone about Kodak and Xerox, and it ends up Kodak created what we know today of as a 401k plan in 1960 and got it tax qualified. Xerox created the same thing, then called a deferred profit sharing plan in 1963. And they began through Conable's entire political career, they educated him on the value of profit sharing. There was a provision in ERISA because the IRS had been seeking to declare those plans as creating taxable income on the portion that the individual employee was given the option of leaving it in the plan or taking it as cash. In other words, a 401k plan. And IRS basically get to 1974 and they get Conable to put a piece into ERISA that prohibits any additional deferred profit sharing plans from being created. By now, there are a bunch of them in banks, and there's some they spread a bit. But it's Xerox and Kodak that have the biggest ones that are being gone after by the IRS. And there's a study mandated in ERISA. And that study was sort of the equivalent of these others, and it basically ended up leading to Conable doing the Revenue Act of 78, which basically said, these are Section 401k plans, meaning we've now defined Section 401k. So in reality, the first 401k plan was created by Xerox Corporation and Kodak in 1960 and 1963. They had the equivalent of matching contributions, end quotes, but in reverse. Those plans were then amended to comply with and became basically combined 401k profit sharing plans. But all of the things that we now talk about, as others say they invented at some point in time, were actually invented by lawyers at Ivins, Phillips, and Barker law firm, which represented the Kodak company in the creation of that first plan.
Thank you for the history. I am going to ask all of you, before we wrap up, sort of what you think the ERISA's greatest accomplishment is. But before we get to that, I would like to ask each of you, what do you think was maybe the least well thought out part of the law, or maybe to put it more, more generously, could have been written more clearly?
Title IV.
I'd agree. Title IV.
Howard?
I think I'm going to give you two. PBGC and the notion of 401k, the way it was devised. Ultimately, okay, but and its impact.
Ultimately, the world we have today of 401k is actually the fault of ERISA. It is not the blessing of the Revenue Act of 1978. You are correct. It was Barbara Conable basically saying to the IRS, you're full of it. Leave these people alone. What they're doing is legal, and we're going to make what they have been doing for 20 plus years legal through the addition of 401k to the code. And to your point, you then add that to the other things that were there, important, but never fully thought out quantitatively. None of the modeling really did it, which was the combined implications of doing broadened participation standards simultaneously with tighter vesting, simultaneously with tight vesting funding standards, and then unanticipated the joining of all of that by the Financial Accounting Standards Board to interpret those ERISA provisions as creating both retiree health ultimately and pension liabilities on corporate balance sheets, which suddenly changed this from a world that was essentially a retirement income provision through annuity payments for long service employees to something that was reallocating significant, ultimately billions of dollars to shorter service employees, thus creating the need for the retirement clearinghouse.
Yeah, there's one other There's one other factor, though, I think, Dallas, in this
Probably many.
tremendous movement away from DBs to DCs. And it's the confluence of the existence of 401ks, which I can tell you from my days sitting in the hearing room, were never intended to supplant DB plans. They were always supposed to be supplemental, but it was the confluence of that and the one provision in ERISA, if I ruled the world, that I would have struck, which is 404C, that allows and has caused the growth of individually directed accounts that leads us with the whole host of problems that we have now.
And it took 16 years to develop the regs to implement 404C.
Of course, yeah.
Howard, real quick, because I want
can't let
the audience
go.
here. Yeah, go
I
ahead.
just, again, context. When this was all happening, the profession saw, the consultants saw, this is great. Now we have a possibility of having both plans work. And in some cases, we designed things called floor plan, where there was a feeder from profit sharing, but a floor of protection from DB. And then the volume of regulation and audit profession and accounting profession and the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times did so much damage to all of that. You can now look at the decline of DB and unintended consequences, I would believe, but that's the result. So we're not in the place we thought we would be, and too many negative results. Too many people only can save with 401k and wind up short because, as we know, and EBRI has been telling us this for a long time, that we have inadequate retirement savings and not nearly the protection we need, especially for those who are the most needy.
Well,
I want to get into.
and you make me think of one other
Right.
piece of this that fits in,
Okay.
which is ERISA also for the first time put in the initial limitations on the design of plans engaging in Social Security integration, which was when the theory was you've got Social Security, you build on that, you build on that. And until then, the subsequent statute, which I was believe in the early 1990s, where essentially legal Social Security integration was eliminated. And so as you took away the ability to integrate, and again, to have this be supplemental for long service employees, and you got down to then 5-year vesting and proposals for 3-year cliff vesting, which were, I think, one of the earliest studies EBRI published in an issue brief form was looking at the proposals for 3-year vesting. And I'll always remember that the average benefit that was going to create was less than $300. But when you added up the $300 over the millions of people that would have been getting $300 checks, it added up to real money. And so, I mean, you get again, things done for the right policy reasons, end quotes, that end up having a series of unintended consequences, all of which that have played to the disadvantage of defined benefit plans in a 401k availability environment.
If we talk fast, we might have time for 1 or 2 questions. Anybody in the audience?
Hopefully somebody's going to ask us about preemption, the crowning jewel
Okay,
of
well,
ERISA.
that was my next question, but I wanted to. All right, you set me up for it. So you also mentioned Congressman John Dent, another one of the true authors. He said that preemption was, quote, the crowning achievement of ERISA. It enabled the unions and multi-state employers to get behind the legislation and support it, and, allows for what we all know. So what do you make of the efforts in recent years to essentially erode it? Do you agree with erosion? And that, I think, brings us back into the healthcare conversation
Yeah.
too.
I mean, my view of this is, while I don't agree with every single one of the pronouncements that the Supreme Court has made and the court cases necessarily, I think they, by and large, got it right. I think the state law, I've been getting lots of calls from Hill staff asking me what I think about these efforts to make amendments to preemption. And I think it's a very bad idea. The one thing that we know is that changing a word in 514 is going to mean 50 more years of litigation as to what it means. And the one thing that we know in our voluntary system is employers need certainty. And it's really remarkable to me, 50 years after the passage of ERISA, there's not the kind of certainty we need, particularly in the healthcare area. And I've been spending a lot of time in these later years on health. And in my view, what the states are doing is they're trying to push the envelope on preemption, but not so much in terms of plan design, plan design. What they're trying to do is get back to regulating their traditional areas of business practices. So for instance, if you look at all the legislation that the states are looking at with respect to PBMs, for instance, or other kinds of service providers in the health care area, by and large, and I put aside any willing provider type of legislation that I think is clearly preempted, but what they're by and large trying to do is regulate business practices that, of course, do have an indirect effect on companies. And then the people who are who don't want regulation, the service providers, they're trying to get the business community, plan sponsors behind them by saying, well, if we have to comply with these state regulations, we're going to charge you $1 gazillion.
Well, and speak from our business members' perspective that they need that certainty and uniformity.
And
I'm gonna hold it off here, okay? And I apologies if there was anybody who did have a question, but you guys will all be around for a while and catch you during the break if there were questions. So lightning round in a minute. What would you say is the law's greatest accomplishment, and what would be maybe one proposal, a policy proposal that you think would improve the employee benefit system?
The worst accomplishment is essentially over time, along with the accounting profession, the essential killing of defined benefit pension
The best
plans
accomplishment.
and annuitization. And the best accomplishment was creating a system that has much wider coverage and ultimately will have much wider benefit delivery, particularly if programs can solve the lump sum distribution spending problem.
And any one proposal? Well, can I take that last part of your comment as your proposal for what would be best to improve the system?
Something that basically defaults to rollovers in the absence instead of it's being, it's in the direction which it's traditionally been, which is the individual presumption is you do a lump sum distribution out of a defined contribution plan unless the employee doesn't want you to do it. And that's changed somewhat as the investment management firms and the administrators decided that having more money to manage over time was advantageous. But as a small employer, I know that keeping track of people over time is not an easy thing to do.
Howard.
Well, I'm smart enough to agree with Dallas 100%. But what I would say is that the other problem has always been for sponsors is Byzantine regulation, just bizarre. And remember what happened to Byzantium, and that's what.
I'll be very quick. I think the crowning achievement of ERISA was to underscore the need or to reinforce the fact that if you followed the rules and worked hard, you didn't have to be actually working on your date of retirement to get a pension. So making sure that people had pensions. As far as if I could change one thing or add one thing, I agree with Dallas on rollovers, but I think the most important thing that we should think about over the next 50 years is going back to a system where we don't have do-it-yourself retirement where professional asset managers are part and parcel of the DC plan universe, and people don't have to be their own investment manager.
So speaking of the next 50 years, I want everyone to mark their calendar for May 8th, 2074, when we will continue this conversation with our illustrious panel and get to all the questions that we couldn't get to today.
I look forward to it.
Thank you all so much. This is not a break. I have the pleasure of introducing our next speaker, Mark EBRI, who is a non-resident senior fellow at the Urban Brookings Institution and former Benefits Tax Council, 2 tours of duty in government doing that, and who's going to chat with us about the history of auto enrollment. Mark? Oh, sorry.
I could listen to those for the whole rest of the day. Fabulous. Thank you, Jim, Barb. I've been asked to tell the backstory of what some might view as the key inflection point in the 50-year history of the private pension system since ERISA, and certainly of the 401k experience. And I'm going to do that from a personal point of view, if that's okay. So once upon a time, while I was at the Washington law firm that I was part of at the time, the Treasury Department during the Bush Senior administration reached out and asked if I'd consider coming on board to help oversee national retirement policy and the regulation of the private pension system, plus employer-sponsored healthcare, sharing those responsibilities for these issues with the Assistant Secretary of Labor. While my partners at Covington and Burling had followed this into government, back out of government route traditionally, my wife seemed to have mixed feelings about it, observing that while the Treasury job would likely involve much longer hours, even more stress, even more pressure than my law partner job, at least it offered an 80% pay cut. Well, actually, I did feel better when she told me that it must have been really hard for Treasury to find someone smart enough to handle this job, yet not smart enough to turn it down. Jim Klein, you know Daryl, my wife, from way back, and I know Jim is thinking now that doesn't sound like the nice, sweet person I know. And you're right, Jim, I made a little of that up. But the history is that I accepted the job, and the greatest challenge over the years, as you fast forward from the earlier 90s to the later 90s, was still what folks have been talking about: the ongoing decline of the defined benefit plans and the relentless shift from defined benefit to defined contribution. Our Treasury team, by 4 or 5 years after I joined the government, still didn't see a silver bullet for rescuing, reviving the DBs. And yet I thought there was something a little bit off in our common narrative that the system had shifted from DBs to DCs. This seemed to be mischaracterizing the problem and maybe even getting in the way of the solution a little bit. While the 401k, of course, is technically part of a defined contribution plan, if you look past the labels, it's actually, especially back then in the 1980s, 1990s, actually more of a do-it-yourself retirement savings account than a real DC plan, like a money purchase pension plan or a target benefit plan or a profit sharing plan that are basically employer funded, that are invested under professional management, to your point, Phyllis, that you were just emphasizing, and that give people the kind of guidance that they need in a world where the average person is not and cannot be a pension expert. By contrast, the do-it-yourself 401k of that era didn't define benefits or contributions. It didn't define much of anything. The do-it-yourself suffered from what we started to call the 7 deadly sins, requiring employees to take the initiative and decide whether to participate, then to actually sign up, only after having to decide how much to contribute and how to invest. This is all too familiar to everyone in this room. Then having to decide how to monitor and update the investments over time. How do you rebalance? What is rebalancing? Adjusting the level of saving over time, if you remember to do that, whether, when, and how much to withdraw before retirement, how to convert your lump sum at retirement into a pension paycheck or a stream of income that will last for a completely unpredictable duration of years in retirement. Employees, you're on your own. So as the financial risks and challenges of retirement accumulation and decumulation have been transferred from employers to individuals, we've devolved from a defined pension system consisting of defined benefit and defined contribution plans in the past, in which employers bore the bulk of the responsibility, to an undefined saving system where benefits and contributions alike are undefined and where individuals are left to fend for themselves. So looking underneath the DB and DC labels, we wondered, and I'm still at Treasury at this point in the story, back in the mid-late 90s, we wondered whether we could identify what makes DBs particularly valuable and replicate those attributes in the 401k frame, in effect, to put the pension back in the private pension system, which we've become increasingly sensitive to describing as such, as we realize more and more that it isn't so much a private pension system as a private retirement savings system. The DB seemed to have its own cardinal virtues that roughly correspond to the 7 deadly sins of the 401k as it existed back then. And the question is whether we could transplant those virtues or good attributes to the 401k to save the soul of the do-it-yourself 401k, as it were. One day, a number of my staff came in. We were doing a briefing on the state of our agenda, all the things that were on our plate. And they said, hey, by the way, don't want to interrupt our constructive meeting, but there's this abstruse, esoteric question that someone asked the IRS about whether, I think it was whether a 401k could permit someone to just, could put someone right in the plan and not have them sign up, and give them a chance to opt out if they wanted to, but just kind of flip the normal election, a kind of a negative election. But apparently my staff told me, no one here at Treasury or at the service has ever heard of any plan trying this. And so it sounds like just an off-the-wall question. And I quickly decided that if plans were not actually doing it, it wasn't important enough to take time away from our various policy projects designed to improve the system and our many other commitments. So some weeks after this remarkable failure on my part to connect the dots, the light bulb finally turned on. If negative elections were legal or could be made legal for 401ks, wouldn't they increase participation, perhaps dramatically, especially among the lower paid and underserved folks, the Black, Hispanic, and female populations that Bob Johnson was particularly focusing on this morning? And what better place to import favorable DB attributes into 401ks than to start with enrollment by arranging for people to participate unless they opt out? Before potentially approving this new technique, we'd have to describe it, define it, and name it. So our team gathered over lunch in my office one day to decide what to call this thing, assuming we decided to approve it. It's a little like a bunch of 14-year-old boys with a rock band, gathered in somebody's garage, and they kind of don't really want to practice, but they're willing to spend endless hours arguing over the name of the band. So I limit it to 45 minutes. We're not going to spend any more time than that on this. But we all were in agreement that negative election was a non-starter. This is Washington after all, right? Names matter and the spin matters. We landed on auto enrollment, automatic enrollment, because it fairly described what was going on and would also prompt the question that we wanted the market to ask: why not extend constructive defaults to all phases of the savings cycle? Auto investment, auto rebalancing, contribution increases, rollover, Dallas, to your point, auto retirement income, hit for the cycle. And as we continued to consider whether to approve 401k auto enrollment, Congress and the executive branch were preparing to jointly hold a major Saver Summit conference on retirement savings, which Dallas Salisbury was instrumental in organizing. And President Clinton, who was then the president, Newt Gingrich, and Senate Majority Leader Trent Lott were going to address the conference. So as things are in Washington in the run-up to the conference, the White House was in full-on feed the beast mode. The president will be giving a talk. He needs some new, sexy, great initiative or proposal to announce and take credit for in his speech to the conference. I hesitated to share with the White House too early the possibility of new guidance to define and approve 401k auto enrollment. I was concerned about whether it would crowd out employer matching contributions, given that the employer match, of course, has traditionally been used to get more people in the plan and to meet non-discrimination standards. And if the market discovered that auto enrollment could be used to meet non-discrimination standards, which it can and does, will they drop the employer match? I lost a lot of sleep over that for months, trying to, with my team, figure out whether that was a real risk or not, and whether we ought to approve auto enrollment. And so even though the pressure to feed the beast kept growing as we approached the date of the conference, which was June 4th, 1998, we kept the White House waiting as we tried to get a handle on this sort of cost-benefit analysis. We started to talk about the issue with stakeholders, and it became clear that there was great uncertainty in the market among the few people who were even talking about this, about whether it was okay to do this negative election. Most people weren't really interested in it or had never heard of the question. But then we found out that there was a company that was actually doing it, unbeknownst to us, McDonald's. But they were using auto enrollment to default employees into McDonald's stock, which raised a policy concern for me. ESOPs are one thing. Giving employees control of the company is one thing. Small amounts of stock in a 401k to give people a little skin in the game, as long as you're fully diversified, that's another thing. But trying to push as much stock, and I'm not suggesting McDonald's was trying to do this, but the concept was evident. Lots of companies were fending off takeovers at the time. DB surpluses, until the excise tax occurred, were drawing takeovers and were used to fund takeovers, and 401ks were being stuffed, as some of us will remember, with employer stock to put a lot of stock in friendly hands and fend off the takeover of incumbent management. So I was worried about that as well as the employer match. And so we tried to figure out whether there's a way to approve auto enrollment without triggering those two dangers. And Craig, we started a little late here, so if it's okay, I'll try to finish up. Could we use defaults not only for enrollment but investing to encourage modern portfolio theory inspired target date or balanced funds, managed accounts, diversification, and democratization of of ownership of stock? The problem was we lacked authority, legal authority, to condition the auto enrollment permission on keeping your employer match going, on not investing in employer stock. And so instead of proposing a regulation, we decided that the preferred art form for guidance for this purpose would be a revenue ruling. A ruling tells a story, a narrative, which it then either approves or disapproves. This enabled us to include the desired behaviors in the fact pattern in the ruling that would then be approved. So in May 1998, we drafted it up. I went to the Labor Department and asked them if they would be willing to bless a diversified asset allocated investment as a default investment, since we were going to do auto enrollment and Labor was fine with Treasury allowing that. But that meant you had to have a default investment specified. And so I suggested something like what became QDIAs. And there was a lot of sympathy at Labor, but not a willingness to actually go ahead and do that. So what we did was ask them to write a footnote to our ruling saying that they'd read the ruling, including the default investment in a diversified fund of stocks and bonds, and then say whatever they wanted to say if it wasn't too negative. And they said, you know, it doesn't meet 404C. It isn't a self-directed, doesn't give the employer self-directed investment protection, but we've read it. And the mere fact that there was that footnote in our ruling that showed that Labor had read and cleared the ruling gave a certain impetus to the idea that even if it wasn't deemed to be a self-directed, employee self-directed investment, there was some kind of aura around modern portfolio theory asset allocated funds. We pulled the trigger in May 98, issued the revenue ruling 98-30 that defined, approved, and promoted 401k automatic enrollment and automatic investments in diversified funds. And on June 4th, President Clinton showcased the ruling in a major speech at the Savers Summit Conference and got major media coverage for the auto enrollment and the auto investing. Apparently, since the facts approved in the ruling made clear that the employer match continued, that the investment was in this diversified fund and not in employer stock, ever cautious ERISA counsel generally hesitated to let their clients venture too far from the contours of the ruling. And so it seems like those two things have stuck over the years. We haven't lost the match. We haven't had default investments pouring into employer stock. And the 401k default investments have shifted over time from principal preservation, which they used to be when there was a default, to target date funds, balanced funds, managed accounts. And this incidentally helped crowd out employer stock, which is a smaller and smaller threat, still an undue threat to employees who are over-concentrated in it. Think Enron, Lehman Brothers, and the like. As we were hoping, it also seemed to give us all of this some political cover by promoting the ownership society, 401ks writ larger, perhaps together with the fact that in the interest of not overdoing the paternalism side of this, we kept the example of default enrollment at 3% of pay, knowing that over time it would get larger, should get larger. And we then issued a bunch of other guidance a couple of years later in the year 2000 that illustrated that you could have higher defaults, that you could have automatic escalation, which Shlomo Ben-Artzi and Richard Thaler had proposed, and that you could do auto enrollment in 403Bs, 457s, et cetera, et cetera. To wrap up, a few years later, I'd left government and drafted an early version, excuse me, of the PPA, Pension Protection Act of 2006 auto enrollment provisions. There were a couple of things that we couldn't do by guidance: preempt state laws, let people get their money back within 90 days free of 72T, 10% tax if they hadn't noticed that they were auto-enrolled. And so Congressman Rahm Emanuel, who was then a member of the Ways and Means Committee, then a congressman, introduced my draft as a bill. We'd worked together in the Clinton administration on some pension things. And this became an early draft of the Pension Protection Act of 2006, auto enrollment provisions. And then a couple of us persuaded the congressional staff that this defined benefit funding bill, the 06 legislation, as well as cash balance bill, could use a little bit of just a few provisions on the side regarding automatic enrollment. And that's how we got the additional legislation. Before it was effective, 40% of large 401ks were already using auto enrollment. And since the PPA, happily, it's gone up to 75 or more percent. The George Bush administration, W. Bush, was more receptive to our suggestions about QDIAs, and Ann Combs, who many of you know, and my former law partner, Rod DeArmond, who was Deputy Secretary of Labor when Ann was Assistant Secretary. The three of us talked about finishing the job, and they were entirely willing to promote the ownership society by doing QDIA guidance. Congress found out that the regulation they drafted was about to come out, so they quickly required the Labor Department to issue a regulation of this kind, which they duly did about 3 weeks after the legislation was passed. That's the highly abbreviated version. And millions of participating employees lived happily, or at least automatically, ever after. Sorry. I'll sit here.
Thank you very much, Mark. I appreciate it. So now after all these legends of ERISA, you get me. So I'm sorry about that. I particularly, Mark has done so much for the system. Thank you so much. And the first panel, particularly Dallas, who got me to start in this industry, I have to thank him for as well. My job was to do a bridge between the history that we just heard and the panel that we're doing next is going to be looking at the future of auto enrollment features or auto features and what are plans doing now to implement it and what they could possibly be doing in the future. So I'm going to be looking at some results from our retirement security projection model, which looks at the amount of money that people save in their retirement system to versus what they were projected expenses going forward. So if you could advance the slide a couple times, right there. We have 3 metrics that we'll be looking at is the retirement readiness ratings, which is the amount, the projected percentage of people that will not run short of money. And then the aggregate shortfall, which will be the amount of dollars that people will run short of these projected expenses. And the surplus is the amount of dollars that they will have above these expenses. So on the next slide, we could see kind of the baseline. This number is a meaningless number. The whole point of this number was to establish if we got rid of auto enrollment right now, going forward, what the retirement readiness rating, what the shortfalls would be, what the surpluses would be. So, you know, going forward. So this 62.8% is without any auto features. I wanted to show this baseline so we could see the impact of the various auto features on the system and how it improves, what the surplus and what the deficits are going forward. So this is not a number that we should be looking at where the system is at is all. It is something that is a baseline for comparison for each of these auto features that we will quickly go through. The first one on the next one, we see that they have the auto enrollment with a 4% default contribution. One of the key things that we have to know is any of these provisions is going to take a while for it to impact. So most of the impact is going to be on the younger part of the cohort. So that's why I'm focused on the younger ages, 30 to 35, 40 to 44, because you have to have the time for those dollars to get in the system, to get in the accounts and have them a compound interest to take effect. So we could see that for a 4% default, we could see that if everyone uses auto enrollment, we can get a 6.9% decrease in our retirement security shortfall. If we go to the next slide, we see that it can go up to 10% for a 6% default rate. Now, what do we do? The next feature on the next one, we're going to add auto escalation to it. So on auto escalation, we can allow that go up to 12%. This particular number is only at auto enrollment for 50% coverage. So this is 50% auto enrollment coverage with 12% up to auto escalation. We could see that in that situation, we decrease the retirement savings shortfall by 6.2% for those 35 to 39, and it goes down as we get for the age. So again, each of these components adds a little bit more. So we go to the next auto feature and we look at auto portability. So now what happens if we automatically shift all of these accounts to their next employer plan? And we could see that depending upon the base of the coverage, we can also have a significant impact on the retirement savings shortfall. If we get all employers that are part of the auto portability system for 30-35, we can decrease the retirement shortfall by over 11%. And then, but the big thing is each of these things are working together. They get us into the system, they get us to save more, and they help us preserve the money in the system. So when we put all these auto features together on the next slide, one more, we could see that the result is really kind of tripling impact of how this can really have almost a multiplicative effect on the impact of what happens to retirement savings shortfall and surplus. You can see the shortfall goes down by over a quarter and almost 40%, the surplus goes up by getting that money into the system, getting people to save more as they go along, and then to help preserve the system as we go along. So that really gives an idea of really all of these features working together can get us in a situation that really improve what we're doing in the employment-based system. Again, all these numbers are still can only impact those that impact. So even though the number was for those that have ever been in the system, they're not always in the system. If I looked at the people that had access to the system their entire career, these numbers or the initial number would go up much higher because one of the big aspects or weaknesses of the system is we don't have coverage for everyone. Getting people into that system is really what changes this and really moves that number and having access though. So this is just a teaser of a full report of what we'll do and just kind of give you an idea of the history, bridging the history to what we can do in the future and how these auto features really truly have an impact. So I will call up Bridget's and panel, Jason and to come up for, thank you.
Thank you, Craig, for that riveting presentation. I'm Bridget Bearden, Research and Development Strategist with EBRI. I just want to assure you, we'll try to get back on track. There might not look like there's a big break in the agenda, but after this session, we will be breaking to go get some box lunches and bringing them back in prior to starting the luncheon address afterwards. So I'm pleased to welcome this esteemed panel. And from your right to left, we have Jason Jagatic from Fidelity. We have Sarah Faye Pierce from Paychex, Ben Roberge from Unum, and Carol Mendoza from Voya Financial. On your right, Ben and Carol represent employer views from the HR perspective. And Sarah and Jason represent provider views. Their bios are available online if you want to look them up. So let's get started. We just saw some pretty compelling results on the impact of auto enrollment provisions on the communities that are often left behind in terms of retirement savings. So starting with Carol, how do these results align with your organizational perspectives, considering your participant population?
Very much aligned. We have had auto provisions in our 401k plan for a number of years, auto enrollment, auto escalation, and we see that these provisions have helped to close gaps in racial and ethnic disparities within the plan. There's more that we can do, but it's very consistent with our own data.
Ben, anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, we do the same at Unum, so very aligned. We have auto enrollment into pre-tax, auto escalation, and recently we actually started auto enrolling our non-highly compensated employees into emergency savings plan, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later in the panel.
And from a provider perspective, what are your thoughts, Jason?
Yeah, so from a provider standpoint, I think we've seen the value of the auto enrollment programs, and we're seeing strong uptick. So we work with a wide range of employers, from some of the largest in the country to some of the smallest. Overall, we see north of 40% participation rate in terms of 40% of employers offering auto enrollment programs. And then when you take a look at that participant level of those that are offering programs, we're seeing north of 90% participation rate. So we've heard a lot about access to the system, and Craig just touched on it in some of the speakers earlier. So we see over 90% of participants are participating when there is an auto enrollment feature, whereas when auto enrollment isn't offered, that's more around the 50% marker. So we see a strong uptick there.
Great. Well, at Paychex, we're a human capital management solutions company. And so we're, providing a broad array of services to our small business clients. And we represent 740,000 small businesses in the US, and then a very small percentage in Europe. And, there's two sides of the coin. It's our small business customers, as well as the 1 in 12 private sector workers that we're paying every 2 weeks or once a month. And so, we have to approach the issue from, really two perspectives. Like, how are we going to solve for expanding access into the system, just to step back from auto enrollment, but then how do we increase participation rates? And certainly we have seen, because we also have been, offering auto enrollment for, well over a decade now, that is the game changer to bring more participants into the system. And so where we start is where we're trying to meet our customers where they're at. First and foremost, we need to educate our customers as well as those small businesses outside of our base, because they're two really significant issues facing small business in order to get them into the system and over some hurdles, cost and complexity. And we have to solve for those. And so simplicity is power at Paychex. And so educating on plan options, and then also expanding out to help those customers, small businesses, understand what the tax incentives can do and how that can really get them into the system, covering the startup costs, the administration fees, is really how we then lead them to the water, if you will, of auto enrollment. And, as we're driving and pushing auto enrollment, what we've seen is a dramatic increase in participation rates between those small businesses that select auto enrollment versus those that do not. And our rates from our participation perspective double when that employer selects the auto enrollment. And that's really important, because in this post-pandemic era, what we have seen, our participation rates in Paychex plans are increasing, ever so slowly, we're about at 40%. But we know as we get more and more of those companies to select auto enrollment, it's just completely changing the game, and it's really going to drive those numbers up.
So I think I'd like to turn to Carol, who's done some innovative programming with their plan. So if there's, John, you could pop up her slides. She can walk us through this plan innovation.
Yeah, so I mentioned the idea that we need to do more. So historically, Voya's plan, well, we have a cash balance plan for a cash balance pension plan, 4% credit to cash balance. We have a 6% match in the 401k. Our auto enrollment percentage was at 3% with auto increase up to 6%. But what we saw was a gap between white and Asian colleagues and Black and African American colleagues in savings rates and match maximization. So what we decided to do was auto re-enrollment. We decided that annually around the merit time when people are getting their bonuses, we're going to bump them back up. And our auto enrollment percentage is now at 6%. The auto re-enrollment percentage is at 6%, and then we do auto increase up to 10. So this is late breaking data. We just did our first auto re-enrollment this year. We've had 2 paychecks now, so I had data after the first one, but I wanted to make sure it stuck. And we're seeing that we've gone from roughly 90% participation in the 401k plan up to 95%. And that the biggest jumps were with our Black and African American and Hispanic and Latino colleagues. So still a gap, and it's going to take some time to see balances improve. But we're taking the right steps and certainly going in the right direction. And then the next slide, that was plan participation. This is match utilization. So the percentage of our employees who are contributing enough to get the full 6% match. The preliminary data from about 2 years ago, we had south of 90% who were getting the full match. We're now well over 90% with this most recent, with this re-enrollment, this first re-enrollment, and again, seeing double-digit increases among our Black, African American, and Hispanic and Latino colleagues.
Very impressive. Very
So
impressive.
do it over again.
So is this, so it's every year you're automatically re-enrolling?
Yeah, this was our first year, but it is our plan to do it every year.
Very good. Great. So I guess starting, maybe we can keep with that theme of kind of surveying your employees, because you had to start off with some kind of data. And so Ben, you've done some work on evaluating your own employee base.
Yeah, we have. We pretty regularly survey our employee about total well-being, so not just financial, but physical, emotional, and tie it to our work engagement survey. We've done that regularly since 2018. So we have a lot of great data of what our employees are doing well from a well-being perspective and where they need some help. For us, they're, consistently, we saw financial stressors being 3 of the top 5 across the board for our US population. So we knew we need to do a little bit better of a job and create some more programs that could help them with that. We have a pretty competitive 401k match, 5% match, and a 4.5% defined contribution, regardless of their contributions. So we knew that that was doing pretty well, but we needed some other programs in place to help support them, particularly around things like money emergencies, debt, budget. So one of the ways that we came at that was trying to create this emergency savings program or a rainy day fund. And so we've been evaluating, and we've actually had a program in place now since the beginning of 2022 of how we were going to do that. We ultimately decided to go with an in-plan solution within the 401k plan. And we actually leveraged a lot of the research from Mark and others about the benefits of doing that and decided that was the best option for our employees. So we launched a program where our employees can, on post-tax basis, contribute to the 401k plan up to $10,000 a year. We chose $10,000 a year when we were designing this because we didn't want to get in any trouble from an aggregate 415 limit. That's continued to increase. So we may increase the limit in the future, but that was the number we started with. We also felt that auto enrollment in this program was super important. When we launched, our record keeper, which full disclosure is Fidelity, didn't have the capability to do that. But we saw pretty good participation on just a regular voluntary participation. And partnered with Fidelity to actually build in a second channel of auto enrollment, which has been live now for over a year. So we're seeing really great results, especially since we launched the auto enrollment. We do limit this to non-highly compensated employees so that we don't get any trouble with non-discrimination testing. And we're seeing about 36% of employees that get auto enrolled into this program stay and contribute. We auto enroll at just 1% on top of the 5% that we do for pre-tax. And we're seeing some really great results now that this program is getting a little bit more mature. Average account balances are about $1,500. We are definitely seeing people take withdrawals from this program, which is a little bit of a mind shift to be okay with that since it's within the 401k plan, but that's exactly what this is designed for. It's there for employees to use whenever they need it for money emergencies, rainy day, what have you. But the thing that we're also seeing is that although people are taking withdrawals, 80% of employees that have contributed to this through the post-tax contribution still have an account balance. So that's exactly what it's there for. It's there when you need it, and people are still contributing and people are still having an account balance. It's also not taking away from what they would be doing from a contribution basis on a pre-tax. We were a little concerned that it might kind of eat into it and wouldn't be additional savings, but we're not seeing that. Actually, our pre-tax contribution rates are staying pretty consistent, and we're getting additional people to contribute auto enrolling at 1%, and average deferral contributions are actually 2%. So some people are even going in there and increasing it beyond the 1%.
So you're not seeing it credit out the 401k?
No.
What you're saying. And do you offer any incentives?
No, yeah, it's a great question. So this is actually 100% employee contributions. So there's no employer contributions to the post-tax emergency savings fund.
Thanks. And so are there any additional features about emergency savings or auto enrollment programs? I mean, we can be broader about the retirement plan and then specific to emergency savings programs that you've seen successful among your employers.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and take that. So I think a major element for us is really about ensuring choice. So there's choice for the employer and there's choice for the employee or the participant, just because the needs of different employers it can be so dramatic, and the needs of the employee can be very different, and they often change over time. So making sure that we've got systems that have that flexibility, that employers can choose what works right for them and their populations, and similarly what employees can do or participants can do for themselves. So that's one key element. But I think you touched on this already earlier, simplicity, right? And so there's this notion of cognitive load and how much people have on their brain at any one time. We see this throughout society. People have a lot that they're dealing with, and they're often while they have all the intention to get involved and to make some of these choices, the more that we can automate this for them, give them the choice to change when they have that time. But those are a couple of the factors. So I'd say that choice and the simplicity are really major drivers for us.
Yeah, I think, what I would say in response to that is, just thinking about the population that we represent. So, of those 740,000 customers I spoke of, more than 80% have 20 or less employees. And so when we put out our research, we're surveying businesses and their employees in the cohort of 1 to 49. And when you look at that across the board nationally, only a third of these businesses are offering retirement savings options. If you break it out, 1 to 4 employees, so businesses that are very, very small, only 21% are offering plans. On the other side of that, 20 to 49, 62.5% are offering plans. And then in the middle, you have about, 50% offering plans. And so, the dirty little word here is the coverage gap. Like, we're existing within that coverage gap. We're on the front lines of that. And so every single day, our focus, again, to harken back, is education, simplicity. How do we get folks in? How do we get people saving? How do we increase those participation rates? And just bring it straight forward to those businesses so they can really understand the benefit, and that overall economic impact is really significant.
So I guess kind of thinking about some of these key benefits or key features of a successful program, is the absence of these features, simplicity, choice, a challenge in implementing the program? Have you faced challenges? Are there other challenges that you faced when implementing programs? I guess starting with Carol.
Have no significant issue with the auto re-enrollment. Surprisingly little noise in the 401k call center and with the in payroll. We gave people plenty of notice. We sent them emails. We sent letters to home. And I was concerned that after the first check that all of a sudden people were going to, oh my God, I can't believe this happened. What did you do to me? But relatively little noise. We were very pleased.
Yeah, from our perspective, very little noise on things like auto escalation, a lot of positive noise on the emergency savings program. We're definitely seeing some people opt out of it, and that's fine if they don't want to participate in it, but we're pretty pleased to see how many people are staying in it. I definitely we'll be talking about Carol about the auto re-enrollment. We don't currently do that. We have pretty similar numbers to what you showed before you started doing that, just about over 90%, but seems like a great way to continue to drive healthy behavior.
Okay, very good. So one of the, actually several times we talked about the Portability Services Network and the power of automating the account movement across employers. So maybe we talk about the automating, the Portability Service Network and the idea and to what extent you're seeing adoption and enrollment and how you're creating awareness across each of you. I guess starting with.
Sure. Yeah. Happy to jump in. So in terms of Portability Services Network, and that was mentioned earlier today, that's an organization that we participate in and play a role in. We think that's a real opportunity to help, particularly those in some of the most underserved communities, right? So that's been a major focus for us. Along those lines, around serving many of the same populations, I think this is maybe taking a different angle to this. But I think this is also where we see some opportunities with now giving access to part-time workers into the private retirement system, right? So, and I think this also goes a little bit to your point a second ago about participation and access. So when we take a look at giving access to part-time workers into the system, when you look at part-time workers, they are overwhelmingly, or at least at a majority level, women, people of color, caregivers, people with disabilities. And they haven't been able to participate. And some of them also are stringing together multiple part-time opportunities in order to create their full-time income. So we're seeing this fundamental, or potentially a fundamental shift in what retirement is and what that relationship is. It's not just one employer for one person throughout their career. We know that job changing has increased overall. So along with work around with PSN and providing access there, I think we're also looking at other opportunities to support underserved communities through automation, through additional services, just to help. Ultimately, a lot of this becomes an equity issue, right? And so that's been a big focus for us as a firm.
Yeah, I think I would just, build on that again, feel a little repetitive here, but just expanding access and bringing new participants in, particularly with auto enrollment, does mean new people are in the system contributing, saving for the first time. And as through policy over time, we're building, flexibility into that system with emergency savings and some other, options, student loan repayment or student loan match, excuse me. Those give confidence to lower income and underserved communities who are new first-time savers to stay in the system and continue to let that system work for them over time.
So before your comments, I know, Sarah, in the past, you've mentioned the definition of part-time employees. Can we think about how seeking clarification on the definition of part-time employees affects the auto enrollment and what you're looking to learn?
Sure. I think we were talking about the definition of, who's subject to the mandate, not necessarily part-time employees, but I think you might have some to say on part-time employees. But, just as we're, approaching implementation and the mandate, coming online, in January this next year, a couple of questions have come to the mind as we're trying to understand what the requirements are and who would be subjected to that mandate. And this idea within Secure 2.0 of saying, the business must normally employ more than 10 employees in order to be subjected to the mandate. And normally employees is not defined in the statute. And so, what we're hoping for is to see some guidance from, IRS FAQs perhaps to really give better direction there. Otherwise, we're going to be left to, advise our plan sponsors to, seek outside counsel, comply in good faith, and so on. And then a follow on to that is, again, definitionally at the start of a plan year, if you haven't met that threshold, whatever it turns out to be defined as by IRS, if you meet that threshold in the middle of a plan year, the question becomes, then when does auto enrollment begin? Would it be the next plan year? The way it's structured in the statute, auto enrollment is to begin at the beginning of each plan year. And so we just want a little more clarity there so we can best advise our plan sponsors and really make sure that we're complying in good faith.
So Ben, sorry to cut you off, but I know that you're engaged with the Portability Services Network. And so tell us about that.
Yeah, so we are going live in June with that for our plan, and echo a lot of the comments already made in this panel and the earlier panels as the reasons why we're doing it. I think another thing that made it a good decision for us is that we got a lot of anecdotal feedback from employees about how complicated rolling over balance is, and especially if it's with the same record keeper, why are you mailing me a check? So I have to mail it back to you. So we think this is a really good first step in making it a lot easier. A lot of what we do is try to create easy systems for our employees to engage with that are automatic for them. So it just helps them move along and build healthy behaviors.
So we all are interested in retirement income, or at least a lot of us are here. So it can take an entire day, but in just a few minutes, can we talk about how some of the visions that you're seeing and what you're currently doing about marrying automatic features with retirement income, and maybe starting with you, Ben?
Yeah, so we are pretty far down our pathway with retirement income on the DC side. We've had a non-guaranteed retirement income solution for a couple of years. We just launched a guaranteed solution earlier this month, and we're launching a second guaranteed solution in the beginning of 2025. I think it's really important to find opportunities to make it automatic and easy, but this is one where we're being pretty careful about how we're doing it. It is a kind of complicated decision for employees. So what we're trying to do is build a lot of automatic education and support around it, not so much automating the decision process of whether to move forward with a guaranteed or non-guaranteed solution. One place that is going to be automatic, though, is the secondary solution that we're going forward with next year is tied to our target date funds, which is going to be the automatic default for investment options. So that's a piece of it. I do think as we move forward, we're going to closely evaluate that because there's a lot of benefits to automating these type of processes. But for now, there's no necessarily automated features in terms of actually opting into the income.
Any additional thoughts?
Yeah, we believe that we've done a really good job at the accumulation phase, but not such a great job at decumulation. And even under the pension plan, see that a lot of our participants take a lump sum rather than just stretching it over time. So a lot of education, but then also looking at what we can do as a plan sponsor around guaranteed income.
Yeah, and I think just to build off that and to maybe echo one of the earlier points, again, I think for us, it's not a one size solution fits all, particularly when it comes to retirement income, right? So it's important to understand the needs of the individual, what they're, what you may have two people with exactly the same financial situation today, but they have very different needs and preferences for their retirement. And so the way that's going to manifest itself into a retirement plan is going to change, and into what the right solution set is going to change. So for us, it's making sure that we have a way of working with the clients, understanding their needs, and then presenting the right mix of capabilities for them.
Are there any questions from the audience about some of the innovative programs that Ben and Carol have launched, how they did it? I see one question.
Thanks, guys. Really good presentation here. Ben, quick question on the emergency fund. Did you guys set at the beginning a target or a goal that you wanted like X% of your employees to have an emergency fund, knowing that some might be in plan and some might already have an emergency fund outside the plan? Did you set a goal? And if so, do you have any context of where you ended up?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think we set a couple different goals. One of them was to have like a dollar amount for the people that are participating. And we thought that anything above $1,000 would be good. So where we're at from an average account balance is pretty satisfying. I think we were overly optimistic in how many people would remain auto enrolled. We were hoping for like 60% because our pre-tax rates are so high. We're at 36, 37. So we're a little bit below that, but we think over time that will continue to build. One of the things with our company that we see is that our highest rates of turnover are within the first year. And we've only been auto enrolling employees for a year. So 35% of employees that, you know, within the first year are going to turn over anyway. So I think as we continue, that number will increase. And we do have other options outside of the 401k plan for them to get financial assistance as well as create kind of emergency savings and high yield savings accounts, for example. So the combination of the two, and we try to communicate them both and, you know, have them both available to our employees is we're pretty happy with the results so far.
So Ben, you said it was 37 and that's the in plan? Okay.
Correct.
Yep. Great. Thank you.
I do see a question from Sean in the back.
And actually, while you go there, maybe I'll just add one comment there. I think just trying to buy some time, but I think also when it comes to emergency savings, Bob Johnson mentioned this as well this morning, but just talking about the importance of people being able to withstand emergency shock, just shocks to their system. Our research has very much shown that there's an incredibly strong correlation to someone's overall financial well-being and their ability to or deal with any sort of shock to their system from a financial standpoint, right? So that resiliency that these emergency savings accounts build in really help with their overall financial situation, not just a point in time one.
A question mostly for, I guess, Sarah and Carol. And I'm not sure if it's been implemented yet or not, but the legislation that's allowed incentives for plan sponsors, small plan sponsors to enroll like a $5,000 credit for them, setting up a 401k account. Has that been put in place? And do you think that'll have a significant impact on the, other 70% that don't offer a 401k? And then also pooled employer plans. Have you considered that? Are you implementing that? Because a lot of us in this room kind of assume and benefit from the scale that we have. But for smaller plan sponsors, they're dealing with a lack of scale and therefore higher fees.
Sure. And the numbers that I just shared about business size and percentages of plans available go to your point exactly, which is, employers are not coming to us, small businesses are not coming to us asking for the tax credits. And that's why I spoke of those hurdles, cost and complexity, because those businesses, think about if you're a 1 to 4 size business, like you're not thinking about what tax credits has the government given me lately. You're thinking about, how do I keep my open for business sign on? Right? That's the question that you're thinking about. And so it's up to us as a leader in the retirement industry to not just go out to inside our base, clients, but also to educate those businesses outside. And so once they understand that those credits are available to them, it's easier for them to come into the system. And then when we have them into the system, and as I was talking about auto enrollment and how we've been driving that as DNA in our culture at Paychex, now 70% of all new 401k clients are adopting auto enrollment. And so while I think it's going to take time for us to see the impact of the mandate over this 2025 plan year, I think at least from a Paychex data perspective, we're going to have some early results there. And it's very exciting. There's incredible opportunity here. And then just with regard to the PEP, and then Carol, I'll turn it back over to you to answer as well. Paychex was the first to launch our PEP. And so our PEP has been around since 2021. And so, when we have an employer coming to us who wants to merge their existing plan into the PEP, they have that option to offer auto enrollment or not to. Our new clients who are going to select the Paychex PEP will be required to accept auto enrollment, of course, if they meet the mandate threshold. And so that's a pretty straightforward answer, but that's how we're approaching it with the PEP.
I speak for Voya plan sponsor rather than Voya 401k record keeper, but we do administer one of the largest PEPs in the country.
Yes, just one moment.
Very curious about the re-enrollment. I know you said you're only in your first year of it, but I know there's always this delicate balance between a little bit of good paternalism and perhaps too much. How did you communicate that? For instance, someone that, is auto enrolled in and then they say, look, I'm done. I don't want to be in it. You're going to basically next year put them back in. And so I'm picturing for your 5-10-year employees, they're going to have to come in almost for those who obviously don't want it, they're going to have to come in and say no all these times. They might forget, and then maybe have, a couple elections happen and then they're out that money from their paycheck. How did you lay this out for them?
We acknowledge that, first of all, there are some reasons why people can't contribute the 6% to get the full match, but that we feel strongly that the best way to close gaps in retirement readiness is to encourage people to contribute as much as they can. So if there's one speed bump every year where you have to go back and take money, change your election, I'm sorry, but for those who may have, well, let me take a step back. One of the things that we have historically had in our plan is the same election for both bonus and base salary. And people would then take their 401k election down to 0 so that it didn't come out of the bonus check, and then they would take it back up. And it would take a few pay periods for people to remember to do that, or they might not at all. We are implementing a separate bonus election for next year so that if people really don't want it coming out of their check, they don't have to think about doing that rigmarole. But people would wait months, even though we communicate about getting back into the 401k after the bonus check. So this is a way of capturing the inertia of people who may have taken it down at some point for whatever reason. And we're willing to take a little bit of noise because paternalistically, we think it's the right thing to do.
We spent a lot of time talking about automatic features for participants, what plan sponsors can do to turn them on. We haven't spent a lot of time, and we didn't actually have this discussion on our prep call about creating automatic features. What are the default features for new plans for employers? So we create these default features and automatic features for participants, but what are providers doing for employers? I think, Sarah, you mentioned one about the tax credit and just automatically setting them up for the tax credit. What kind of opt-ins, like for Secure 2.0 provisions, for example, are you thinking about as setting defaults for some of your clients? Have you given any thought to that?
No, I mean, when we're talking about our clients outside of our PEP, I mean, it's really up to them and, our product development and customer service teams to select the right options. So it's customizable.
Okay.
Yeah, and I'd say that's a very similar trend for us. I mean, huge spectrum of clients. But then, we try to simplify the experience for new employers who are onboarding by sharing education and case studies and giving examples, but ultimately it's at their discretion.
Other questions from the audience? So I guess we do have a few minutes. Oh.
Maybe it's for Ben and Carol, and you guys have talked a lot about kind of the front end and the auto part. My question is, are you guys measuring engagement here? And why I say that, I mean, people can become defaulted, but are they really engaged? Even though it might be the right thing for them. So that's kind of one of the challenges that I think, I've had in discussions about it, just that measure of engagement, whether it's, Fidelity looking at something, have they done something, put a beneficiary in place or anything like that?
We have a number of measures that we use. Did you register through the website? Have you set up your beneficiary? Have you gone in? How many times have you gone in to check your balance? And there's a nice balance, right? We don't want you day trading, but we don't want you to completely leave it alone. One time a year, that's my message. Go in on your birthday and look at everything and then leave it alone. But we measure all of those on a quarterly basis to see what more we can do to encourage people to do the right things, but then leave it alone.
Yeah, we take a similar approach of measuring those type of statistics too. And I would always love more engagement, but overall we get pretty good engagement with the tools and resources.
So we'll do kind of rapid fire down the line. Some of your last thoughts on automatic features overall.
Not specifically automatic features, but Ben touched on something that I wanted to touch on as well, and that's talking to your employees and understanding what's preventing them from being able to save as much as you would want them to. And I think our communications, maybe 20, 25 years ago were pretty condescending. And we said, well, if you skip that Starbucks every day, maybe you could save more money. But there are real issues that people are facing that prevent them from doing it. And then as plan sponsors, as employers, what are the things that we can do to help people bridge those gaps? And as an example, something that we did at Voya was launch student loan repayment program, because we knew that that was a significant burden for many of our employees, especially those who were lower waged. And we have then measured a year and a half into the program, how many are contributing more to the 401k. And we have seen a 1% increase, from 4% to 5% contribution rate to the 401k. So listening to employees, understanding their financial burdens, and then trying to help bridge those gaps is important.
Yeah, completely agree with that. And I think I've said this already a couple times during the panel, but we think auto features are really important, just making it as easy as possible for our employees to help create those healthy behaviors. And there's a lot of inertia and momentum about like, okay, I'm stuck in this and that's good. So if we're going to do that type of thing, we want to set it up in a way that is beneficial to them.
I think I'm aligned to both of your comments. And I think what I would add to it is auto features, automation breeds innovation and allows, again, us to be able to cut to the quick and bring simple, clear, understandable solutions to these very small employers who are most focused before anything else on keeping their doors open day to day. And that's the name of the game for these businesses, and just encourage you to give some real thought behind that, because that's the battle. And so we're here to help them make sure that they can achieve that goal first and foremost, and then get on to these other very important benefits for their employees.
And then I guess, just building off all of that. So I think automation is an important tool. It's a start, but it's not the only tool that you need to use to engage your employees and to help them, right? So you still need the educational programs. You still want back-end integration. You still want coaching access and additional services, right? So it's that complete picture. So it's really about understanding their needs and helping to develop a solution. Automation helps remove some of the barriers, but it's not the only component.
Thank you. And everyone, let's thank our panelists. So we do have a break for lunch. So there are box lunches. It's 12:40. Please come back at about 1 o'clock. Our luncheon address is going to start. So we do ask that you just grab your lunch box, come back, and we'll have some folks come around and help collect the debris. So thank you, and see you at 1.
Good afternoon. We're going to get started with our lunch keynote. I'm Paul Fronston, Director of Health Benefits Research at EBRI. It's my pleasure to introduce our lunch keynote speaker, Robert Andrews. Rob Andrews currently serves as the CEO of the Health Transformation Alliance, also known as HTA. As CEO of the HTA, Andrews oversees the strategic direction of over 60 major corporations that have come together in an alliance to do one thing: fix the healthcare system. There is much more detail about what Rob has accomplished at the HTA in his bio, which there's a link to on the EBRI website. I encourage you to read it. Rob served as a member of the U.S. House of Representatives for nearly 24 years. Upon his departure from Congress, President Obama praised Andrews' service as, I quote, an original author of the Affordable Care Act and a vital partner in its passage and implementation, and cited his tenacity and skill in representing the people of New Jersey. Rob holds the record for the highest number of votes ever received by a U.S. House candidate in the history of the state of New Jersey. Again, I encourage you to look at his bio. Please join me in welcoming Rob Andrews.
Thank you, Paul. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm really honored to be part of a program that has heard from so many leading lights as we celebrate the 50th anniversary of a law that has done so much good for so many. And to Barb, to you and to Jim and Paul and others involved in planning this program, what I've heard this morning, I can tell you that some of the most famous members of Congress were with us this afternoon. They'd be bored to tears and totally disoriented as to what to do. I can think of no higher compliment to you than the fact that the program reflects that. I mean, who would think that gathering a group of serious-minded experts who've been involved in the writing and administration of a major law to talk about substantive policy, who would ever think that that would contribute to the national debate in any meaningful way? I don't see any tweets coming out of this. I haven't seen anything go viral yet. I'm not finished. But it really is, it's a pleasure to be part of something this important. One of the unfortunate tropes in American culture has become people who are career civil servants who serve because of their belief in the public good and who sacrifice considerably for the public good are now regarded as the deep state. And then a lot of other people who are professionally trained and who work very hard and sincerely advocate for points of view for clients and those who are part of groups that they're in are regarded as the swamp, the lobbyists who are Satan's army here in the nation's capital. I wish more people could see just how wrong that is. And this morning's conference really lent much credence and support for the proposition that people who are deeply skilled, who care a lot and know a lot, can contribute so much to the development of the country. I know a little bit about the difference between what you're called and what you do as a former member of the House. That when I was first elected in 1990, obviously there was no internet. I was in large part responsible for creating it during my tenure. There was no internet. That people communicated by phone calls and mail. And I had an Aunt Roberta in California, for whom I'm sort of named. And the family helped her follow the campaign from afar. I was from New Jersey. She was in California. And she would get news clippings that people would clip out of the newspaper. For those of you under 40, a newspaper is a piece of paper that you buy and hold in your hand. But they would send her news clippings, and she kept up with the campaign in that way. And after I was fortunate enough to be elected, I called her and said, Aunt Roberta, I have great news. I won. I'm going to Washington, D.C. I'm going to be a United States congressman. And she said, oh, Rob, I'm so proud of you. I'm so happy for you. Imagine how good that's going to look on your resume when you go to apply for a job someday. So what we are called and what we do are two very different things. And what so many of you have done in this room, and I hope will do in years to come in this room, is to use this artfully drawn statute for the benefit of good, so that the people that Bob Johnson talked so eloquently about this morning, the single mom whose refrigerator breaks down, is not in the peril that she finds herself today because she has some savings to lean back on. Or that a person who gets the dreaded news that there's some problems early in her pregnancy and that she really desperately needs to know where to go to have a successful course of care in that pregnancy so that the baby's born healthy and that she's healthy, and just doesn't know where to turn or what to do. These are the people that you are helping, and these are the people we can do more for. So to me, the discussion about ERISA is a discussion about the principles on which it's formed, the policies that should inform it in the years to come, the potential that the proper application of those policies could create, and then the promise, the exhilarating promise of aspiration, if we do the first three things that I said, how much better we can make it for so many people. The principle of ERISA echoes a hugely important principle more generally in American history. An ancient phrase, which no one ever uses anymore, but you can read about it in the history books, is that in the early days of the Republic, before the Constitution was enacted in Philadelphia, about a decade or so after the 11 years, I guess, after the Republic won its independence, that's worth about as much as a continental. Has anyone ever heard that phrase before? It's an archaic phrase, and here's what it relates to. The currency that the colonies used during the Revolution and tried to use for a period of time after the Revolution was called a continental. And it quickly became worthless because of inflation and because of other problems that happened. And its worthlessness, the inability of the government under the Articles of Confederation to produce a stable currency and therefore a stable economy, in part led to the Constitutional Convention, which led to the Constitution under which we live today. The principle of that Constitution and its attempt to fix the currency problem was that a seamless economic market would best serve the cause of economic growth and prosperity among the colonies. So one of the first things that went into law after the Constitution was ratified was the Coinage Act, which took advantage of the new constitutional authority of the Congress and the executive branch to create and enforce a currency. And that led to an uneven, inequitable, but fairly steady story of growth. Last thing I looked at in my news feed, after searching again for how some of the members of Congress would feel about this, last thing that I look for, I noticed that the Dow hit 40,000 for the first time this afternoon. Now it'll be back to 28 or something by the end of the week. I get that, but I believe there is a direct connection between the decision of the framers of the Constitution to empower a central government with the ability to create a seamless market among the colonies and the great wealth that has been created, though inequitably distributed, created since that time. ERISA does the same thing. It creates a powerful interstate market, a uniform, seamless market, so that when people think about saving and investing money, or when employers think about providing health care, they can do so under one dependable, predictable, uniform set of rules. So the principles on which ERISA are founded are really, in my view, the prescription for successful policy about anything. The first is ERISA creates a market, a seamless interstate market. And the second thing it does is to impose on the players, some of the players in that market, a fiduciary responsibility to the people for whom they are accountable. And if you think about the best things that have happened, in my view, in American history, Social Security reflects the same principle. A national retirement floor, a retirement guarantee that is handled, sometimes mishandled by the elected officials as fiduciaries for the retired people of the country or the disabled people of the country. The things that we've done best have followed that principle. Look at the miracle of telecom, which I had the privilege of voting for in 1992. And before 1992, there was a local phone bill, a long distance phone bill, a cable television bill. If you had a computer, any sort of computer capability, a computer servicing bill, et cetera. And in 1992, almost unanimously, things used to be this way. The Congress passed the Telecommunications Act that wiped out those verticals and said to Verizon didn't exist then, it was called Bell Atlantic, but it said to Bell Atlantic and to Comcast, a small cable television operator in suburban Philadelphia at the time, go compete with each other. Go find the best way for people to take photographs of their lunch and send it to people and their families. But go make it possible for people to communicate with each other in such a powerful way. Seamless markets that are well regulated work. And that's what we've been given a chance to do with ERISA. Now, in terms of public policy, where there certainly will be debates that go on, I think you go back to the well-articulated principle. It may have been Cicero who said this: if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Preemption is the crown jewel, Phyllis, of ERISA. And it is preemption that the trade-off is, and it's a brilliant trade-off. The trade-off is, if you want preemption, you must earn it by acting like a good fiduciary. That's the trade-off. And I think everything we do, every piece of legislation that we see thought about or offered at the state or federal or local level should be viewed for that prism. So let me offend my friends on the left side, that as much as I understand their concern about the ever-rising cost of pharmaceutical products and their desire to do something about it, when I see state governments, in some cases city governments, impaneling drug price regulation boards, it worries me, because I do believe it's an impediment to that seamless market that we need to prosper. I'm not sure that the vaccines that lifted us 4 years ago from this meeting 4 years ago would have been a huge Zoom call. None of us would have been here. If we went to the supermarket that day, it would have been with a mask. My wife used to go with like a mask and a moon suit on because she was so worried that we'd get infected. I'm not sure that the vaccines that made this meeting possible would have been invented if there were 51 separate price fixing boards for pharmaceutical products. I'm not sure. And so to my friends who on the more liberal side who want to do that, I would say, let's be really careful. To my friends on the conservative side who want association health plans, they've wanted it forever, they still want it, it's what they think is good. That to me breaks the covenant, because it says that I believe, and I think the framers of ERISA believe, that if you want the benefits of preemption, you must earn it by being a good fiduciary. And by stripping away certain protections that federal law provides, I think it violates that covenant. So I would urge the Hippocratic Oath. I do know who said this one, Hippocrates. First, do no harm. And I think every provision that we think about with ERISA needs to be looked at through that prism. Preemption is not just a technical, statutory, legal phrase or construct. It is a powerful dynamic that creates the market that I believe has served us unevenly, but well. Which then leads me to the point of what is the potential of what we could do with ERISA. And I heard Mr. Johnson this morning talk about the potential of working within that framework to remedy what I think most of us agree is an inexcusable variation of wealth based on race in the country. He probably could have added to that rural status, gender, and certainly some other qualifications or other conditions, I should say, as well. The same is very much true in healthcare. I think to understand what we can do with the U.S. healthcare system, you have to understand what has been done and what has not been done in our time working on this. What has been done is the vaccines that ended, for all intents and purposes, the pandemic. Think about this for a minute. I mean, we were in a place, again, 4 years ago where life had stopped. And what happened, and I think the Trump administration deserves credit for laying down this challenge. The Biden administration deserves credit for making sure it was implemented. That's a rare, and Sona City's probably never said that in one sentence before, but I think it's true. The Trump administration said, listen, pharma industry, whomever can create a vaccination that's safe and effective will buy every dose. There was a powerful incentive to get the right thing done, and it got done. Compare that to the unbelievably growing problem, no pun intended, of obesity and type 2 diabetes, the problems that come with it. By any objective measure, it's worse than it was before the Affordable Care Act, before Medicaid and Medicare were passed. It just keeps getting worse. And I think the difference between the success in the creation of those vaccinations and the failure in which we all share responsibility is the fact that the incentive for the industry to create the vaccines was clear, dependable, and real. Who has the incentive to attack the obesity problem? Is it carriers? Not for self-insured employers, it's not. Maybe for themselves if then they're fully insured. But they only have lives for a typical duration of 14 months. Do you want to pay to renovate a kitchen of a condo that you rent or one that you own? Same can be said for Medicare Advantage patients, where 27% of them switch plans each year. Does Medicare have this incentive? Sort of. But Medicare recipients are voters, and people who work for health systems are voters. And anytime that you disrupt and say, you know what, we're going to start steering people toward the providers in the country that best prevent obesity and away from those who don't. There would be a National Association of Obesity Producers that would be formed immediately. And they would write to people like I used to do and say, how dare, Uncle Sam in Washington interfere with our business and your job? And it would be very, very, very hard to do through Medicare. Same story with Medicaid. So what about employers? And that's why those of us who work together on HTA are engaged in this. And we have many brothers and sisters in this marketplace. Business groups on health and other national associations who spend a lot of excellent time and thought in making this possible. And so many of our members here today, Paychex is here, Health Equity is here, Prudential is here, Shell is here. We're proud that all those companies are part of what we're doing. What we're trying to do is to make the incentive structure for everything be like it was for the vaccination. As many dollars as we can put behind care providers who cure illnesses and create great outcomes, that's what we're trying to do. We're growing. We're a little above 70 companies now, and we by no means can be the dominant force in this market, but we can be a catalyst. And for our members who are most actively engaged in what we do, if you want to use hospital readmissions as a measure of quality, and it's an uneven one, but it's a pretty broadly accepted one, our most engaged members have hospital readmissions on a risk-adjusted basis, 29% less frequent than those who are not involved. Total cost of care, about 15% risk-adjusted, less than who are not involved. Now, we want this to be really clear. None of our members says, oh, let's do healthcare on the cheap. Let's save a lot of money because Mary over here is pregnant. No, well, what they want to say is, what can we do if Mary is that person who hears early in her pregnancy that there's a high risk of preterm birth? What can we do to help her? How can we best intervene for her so it is more likely that she will have a full-term or near-term birth, the baby will be healthier, she will be healthier, and yes, they'll both cost less to take care of. The issue is this choice that we can either spend a lot of money and take good care of people or spend less money and not take very good care of them is a false choice. We believe what can and must be done is that we must, through taking better care of people, through doing that we'll be in a position to save money as well, which leads me to the final point, which is the promise of what could happen if institutions work together. With the kind of public policy I talked about, with the kind of market player effort that we're a part of, I truly believe this, that there are children born this month who may live to be 200 years old. Now you say, and I really hope to be there at their birthday party too when that happens, but you might say, well, that's fantastic. I mean, that's sort of out of science fiction. My father was born in 1910, about 4 years, I think, after the Wright brothers had first flown an airplane. By the time he was 59 years old, he and my mother and I watched Neil Armstrong walk on the moon on television. That's what happened in 59 years of his lifetime with computing capability and data sets that are tiny scintilla fraction of what we have today. So do I believe that all genetic medicine will work right away? I do not. But I know that 2 children who were congenitally blind just last week had an experimental genetic therapy and they could see that happened. I know that livers, which is the one organ in the human body which has regenerative capabilities, that and the memory, I sometimes think, but it has regenerative capabilities, that there are drugs very close to the market here that would go far deeper into a liver infection and restore that regenerative capability for that organ. Is every one of these attempts going to succeed? I promise you they will not. But I feel even more strongly about the promise that if we have a system that directs incentives toward those who are trying to achieve great outcomes, these things will happen. A diagnosis of childhood leukemia used to be a death sentence. Now it's, for most families, a manageable disease. So that's what we can do. That's what we can do. And I think that each one of us has a chance to contribute in our own way to that, because the very wise framers and implementers, the Hall of Fame that you've seen up here today, wrote and executed on a law that created a seamless national marketplace that empowers men and women with resources to invest them in a way that achieves great, great outcomes. No one will tweet that today. You won't see it on Rachel or on Hannity tonight. But it's the serious work that goes on here by very serious and accomplished people. And I'm really proud to be associated with them and grateful for all that they've done. Thank you very much. Thank you.
There we go.
I see one back there, Paul.
One second.
Curious for your thoughts on AI and if there's any kind of near-term opportunities.
AI is going to change the world in everything, healthcare especially. We prefer not to use the word AI because it sounds like some robot is diagnosing your mom. We prefer to think of it as enhanced intelligence. We think that the combination of a smart, well-trained provider, a doctor, a nurse, a therapist, plus the incredible power of generative AI is going to solve problems faster. One of our executive committee members, our chairman, is fond of saying that AI asks better questions sooner. And that's what we think is going to happen in healthcare. Now, one thing that we insist on, and we're encouraging all of our employers, and I think all of you are doing this to insist on this, is that AI needs to be a tool in the hands of competent men and women, not a replacement for competent men and women. But I think it's going to expedite the genetic medicine, the regenerative medicine, the miracles that I made reference to. I think AI will be an incredible force behind those changes. Paul?
Rob, you've got at least what, 9 million covered lives in the Alliance?
It's
More than that?
5.5 domestic, about 8.5, 9 internationally.
Okay.
Yep.
And that makes you what, like the 13th largest state in the US?
I guess I'm the governor of the 13th largest state in the US. Where's my state police escort? Yeah, it does actually. I think we're actually the 6th largest buyer of healthcare. Behind obviously Uncle Sam and Medicare, the states and Medicaid, the FEHP. But I think we're the 5th or 6th largest. Yeah.
Most employers would yell us of clout, right? Even the largest employers, because they don't even come close to where you are. Can you discuss how your size in the context of ERISA has made it easier for you and your members to get the kind of numbers that you mentioned on things like hospital readmissions?
Yeah, it's helped us in 3 really important ways. The first is we get to listen to the men and women who are where the rubber meets the road. Andy Gregg is here today from Prudential, and his job every day is to get better results from Prudential. And we get to listen to him and his peers, and we learn from doing that. The first thing is the knowledge of the people actually doing the work. Not the whiteboard people, not the political people, the people actually doing the work. Second, data. Every member of the HTA contributes de-identified claims and demographic data to a data aggregate that we use. It now has north of 4 million lives in it. And it lets us see, and I won't give you the answer, but you'll see it soon. I wonder if GLP-1s really reduce the total cost of care. Wonder if they're overpriced or not. Well, we don't really have to rely upon a survey that a drug manufacturer paid for to answer that question. We can see for ourselves. And that is a very powerful tool. And then thirdly, yeah, like anything else, that you get a better deal on cases of water by being a Sam's Club member or Costco than you do if you're not. And again, I would make this really clear. None of our members wants the cheapest mammogram. They really don't. What they want is a provider who is really skilled and really compassionate for the person getting that mammogram, but they absolutely want the best price they can get for it in the first value. So like with anything else, it's why the union movement happened, right? Collective bargaining works. If you have a like-minded group of people who are willing to understand their own differences and disagreements. Another cardinal principle for us is that Andy Gregg runs his health plan at Prudential. We don't. But we're a tool that he can use for that purpose. But we're an option for people that they run their own plans, obviously.
Rob, I think we're out of time. Thank
Yep.
you so much.
Hey, thanks very much, everybody. I appreciate you.
Hi, I'm Elise Schuman, and I'm the Senior Vice President for Health and Paid Leave Policy at the American Benefits Council. And I have the pleasure of introducing our speaker for our pop-up session on paid leave. We heard earlier about the Wild West of the world of employee benefits 50 years ago before the enactment of ERISA. And now we're going to hear from Josh about the Wild West of paid leave benefits now, particularly as more and more states and localities enact their own paid leave laws in the vacuum created by the lack of federal legislation. So Josh is a partner from the law firm Seyfarth Shaw from New York and a real expert on paid leave. So we're thrilled to have him join us today. Josh?
Thanks, Elise. Hi, everyone. Great to be here with you this afternoon. It's a pleasure seeing you all. Love coming down to DC for these events and conferences. This is my first one with EBRI. I work with the American Benefits Council fairly regularly on their paid leave priorities and strategies. I'm really happy to be here with you for these few minutes today on the pop-up talk on paid leave. So have three main topics I'm going to be covering. The first is just to give everyone a lay of the landscape on both state and local paid sick leave laws, and then separately paid family medical leave laws to see what happens when preemption and harmonization and equivalency doesn't exist. Then we'll talk very briefly about what some of those challenges are for employers and their employees when you have a patchwork of laws scattered around the states and those laws diverge from one another in a variety of different ways. And then the third thing we'll cover is very briefly what's coming down the pipe. What are we looking forward to as possible new states and new additions to this patchwork of laws that we're seeing? So if we can go to the next slide. Perfect. Thank you. So we'll start with paid sick leave. It is the messier of the two. Doesn't necessarily mean that it's more complicated, but the messier of the two setups. The paid sick leave landscape today, you can see in that column, the total mandates column, there are in the mid-50s, about 56 total paid sick leave laws scattered around the country today. Now, one thing that paid sick leave and paid family leave laws have in common, and there are many, many differences, but one thing that they do have in common is that there isn't a singular type of law under either umbrella. Paid sick leave laws are made up of paid sick leave, paid sick and safe time, paid safe time, the newest addition to this group, the mandatory PTO or paid any reason leave laws. You also have COVID leave laws, which are almost all gone except for one straggler in New York State that now has a sunset date 2 Julys from now. You have public health emergency leave and so forth. So the numbers making up, the laws making up this number on this slide take all of those into consideration. Now, you also see at the bottom of that total mandate slide that rewind 3.5 years ago, the number of laws was close to 70. Now, the reason for this is that the landscape is constantly ebbing and flowing. A number of these COVID leave laws have sunset, as I mentioned a minute ago, but you also have developments where a new statewide law might come out and it could preempt local laws. Doesn't happen often. Didn't happen when Illinois passed its PTO law that went into effect on January 1st of this year. Didn't happen when Minnesota passed its statewide paid sick leave law that went into effect earlier this year on January 1st. But Duluth in Minnesota decided to voluntarily sunset its local law. So that created a little bit of an easier burden for folks in Duluth. Even though the number of sick leave laws today is lower than it was 3.5 years ago, it doesn't mean that there aren't frequent changes in the space. And that's one of the big things that's been happening. And what we're starting to see are laws not just being passed in new locations, but new types of laws being passed. I mentioned the PTO, paid any reason leave laws. You can see in that states column, the 19 states plus DC, Illinois, Maine, and Nevada are all falling to that group. We just saw Connecticut amend its paid sick leave law last year to add a mental health wellness day as a covered reason. New York just amended its paid sick leave law last month to add a paid prenatal leave bucket of time. First in the country to do that. It's 20 hours of paid prenatal leave on top of the paid sick leave that New York State already requires. That's starting in January of 2025. In about a month and a half, Chicago is going to have the country's first ever combo paid sick leave and PTO law, right? That one's starting up in a month and a half. The final rules just came out about a week ago. Lots of employers are struggling to implement changes to their policies and systems based on that requirement. So those are some of the changes in the paid sick leave landscape that we've seen. This is what it looks like today. If we go to the next slide, we'll see what the paid family leave landscape looks like. Not as many laws, but close, comparable to the number of states, right? It was 19 plus DC in the sick leave landscape. We have 13 plus DC in the paid family leave landscape. And as I said a minute ago, the paid family leave laws are coming out in a variety of different types and formulas as well. You have, as far as the mandates go, statutory disability insurance laws in 5 jurisdictions. And then you have paid family leave laws in 4 locations, all 4 of those states, California, New Jersey, New York, Rhode Island, that have a paid family leave law, also have a statutory disability insurance law to fill the gap, the missing medical component from their paid family leave programs, which are covered by the state's disability insurance program. And then you also have states and plus Washington, D.C. that have a paid family medical leave mandate. Lots of changes in this space as well. In just the last handful of months, we've seen Oregon's program come online. That was back in September. It was amended in some major ways just a few months ago in March, including how it coordinates with the state's unpaid family leave law, as well as how it coordinates with employer-provided paid leave, PTO, parental leave, short-term disability, and so forth. Colorado's program came online back in January, and we saw Maryland just amend its program to move back some of its effective dates because they're having a slightly harder time standing up some of the details of their program, giving themselves more of a runway. But we have 4 jurisdictions, Delaware, Maryland, Minnesota, and Maine, all with paid family leave laws that are coming online between now and mid-2026. So lots of activity in the paid family leave space as well. And if you go to the next slide, we'll see that the paid family leave space also has another wrinkle. It has these voluntary programs or these paid family leave being added as a class of insurance, which started in Virginia about 1.5 years ago. And now there's more than 6 states that have added paid family leave as a class of insurance. These are alternatives to the paid family leave mandates that I mentioned on the last slide. But what we're starting to see, even though these alternatives are out there, and Virginia is sort of the first test case on this, we haven't seen in the last 1.5 years a huge uptick as far as folks adding family leave as a class of insurance as a private option. So that even though these could be signs of where paid family leave might be heading down the road, and certainly from political alignment, more of the red and maybe purple states would look to this as opposed to imposing a mandate on employers within their jurisdiction. This doesn't seem like the avenue that's going to satisfy the paid leave advocates that are pushing for paid leave in states. So we'll see where this one goes. It's certainly an option that has taken a large amount of growth in the last 1.5 years. Next slide, please. So that's the landscape. Those are the paid family leave laws, the paid sick leave laws. What we're left with in both settings is a patchwork of laws where each law has divergent characteristics from the other law. Now, this snapshot, which I'll get to in just a second, is an infographic that my firm, Seyfarth Shaw, and I and our team prepared with our friends at the American Benefits Council. We rolled it out last summer. We've used it in webinars and other marketing tools. Really useful snapshot of just 4 substantive topics across the paid family leave law spectrum. Each of the paid family leave laws and paid sick leave laws carries between 2 and 3 dozen substantive requirements. And as I mentioned, those requirements diverge from one another. There are variations across the board. What that leads to are challenges for both employers and their employees in terms of understanding what their benefits are, keeping up with the pace of change as these laws are being rolled out, implementing new policies, right? Revisiting policies that a lot of companies spend a lot of time and labor and thought leadership putting together, only to have those policies upended when a new law or 2 or 3 come out, or existing laws are tinkered with and changed, as I mentioned, has been happening in the paid sick leave space. Where you land as an employer is a hope that you can have a one-size-fits-all approach, right? Hope that preemption might come and save the day. Hope that you can get some level of equivalency or harmonization across these laws. And that just isn't what we're seeing. And that's especially true in the paid family leave space, because one of the big differences with paid family leave versus sick leave is that insurance component, right? These laws are very much designed comparably to workers' compensation and unemployment, with the state public program being in the mix, or the alternative private plan route for employers to work with a carrier or third-party administrator to set up a private plan approval. But to get a private plan approved, and that doesn't exist in every jurisdiction with paid family leave. Rhode Island and DC don't allow it. There's what the top box in that top right corner shows you there on the slide. In the states that do allow it, though, there are substantive criteria that have to be met. There are administrative criteria that have to be met. But on top of all of that, there's a commonality that says you have to provide equal or greater benefits than what our public program would provide. And because of differences in things like intermittent leave, definitions of family member and serious health condition, waiting periods, the covered reasons, the amounts of leave, how the pay is structured, how the coordination with company policies is operated, employers cannot set up a one-size-fits-all approach in these states. That is the fact of paid family leave today. And that's the Wild West, the alternative reality to what so many of you who deal with ERISA and are ERISA experts, this is the alternative to, had it not been 50 years of preemption and harmonization and uniformity, this is what we're left with. And again, so to point out just a few seconds on this patchwork graphic here, if we go to the next slide, please, it's a zoomed in version a bit. So this shows 4 categories. It shows the amount of leave that each of the laws provide across different categories of leave: medical, family, military, exigency, and caregiver leave, and then a category of other leave, right? These laws are more than just family member caregiving, bonding, my own serious health. They can also cover bereavement, bone marrow and organ donation, safe time domestic violence leave, public health emergency leave, and so forth. And you can see in that green column, some laws don't have any of those additional categories. Some have 1, some have 2, some have 3, depending on the jurisdiction, right? And that can impact how all these things interplay with company policies and other state laws. This graphic also shows you the percentage of wages being paid to employees and divergence there, the inability for employers to treat their workers equitably, even if they're performing the same role, same position, but just in a different state, right? The percentage of wage replacement varies from one state to the next, and in some places in significant percentages, right? Some at 60, 70%, some all the way up to 100%, like you see in Oregon. And that's not 100% full wage replacement. There are weekly maximum caps in each of these jurisdictions. And then finally, this graphic shows the differences in family members as well, non-immediate family members outside of parent, child, spouse, grandparent, grandchild, and sibling. A lot of these laws will go a step further. Many of them will cover someone who's the equivalent of a family member as well, which leads to complications day to day for companies to administer. So what these complications result in, as I said a minute ago, are challenges on employers from a policies perspective, from a programming perspective, getting their HRIS, payroll, and timekeeping systems up to date, training their managers and their HR how to administer these benefits on a day-to-day, and then getting all of that information out to their employees in terms of how their leave operates, how they can coordinate it with the company-provided benefits. Next slide, please. So what's coming next? Paid sick leave landscape. This is just a quick snapshot. I mentioned the top half of bullet points already, some of those developments that we've seen. The New York State paid prenatal leave, also amendments to Connecticut's law that are just being passed actively right now. We're waiting for Governor Lamont to sign the legislation, but it's expected in the coming days. But the bottom set of bullet points, right? So federally, seems unlikely that we're going to have a federal paid sick leave mandate at any time in the next 2, 3, 4 years, and certainly that it would do anything to resolve this patchwork of laws. Right, the focus federally really is on paid family leave, paid family medical leave, as we'll talk about on the next slide for just a second. At the state level, though, a lot of potential. Delaware, which passed a paid family medical leave program last year, is pushing very hard to get sick leave across the finish line this legislative session. There are ballot initiatives going on in both Nebraska and Missouri for this upcoming election in several months. Historically, if a paid family leave mandate makes it onto the ballot, it passes. So keep a very close eye on those two jurisdictions. And there's also some good activity going on in other places like Virginia, where there is a statewide mandate, but only impacting certain home health care workers. Could that be expanded to all private employers, and other jurisdictions like Hawaii and Pennsylvania as well? Municipalities, pay attention to New York. They might do something like what I spoke about for Chicago a few minutes ago, adding a PTO personal time law on top of the city's paid sick leave law. Next slide, please. So finally, we have the paid family leave landscape. What's coming next? Some good news, I suppose, in the middle of all the doom and gloom I've been talking about so far, is that 3 jurisdictions that came very close to passing paid family leave this session, New Mexico, Hawaii, and Virginia, all fell short for various reasons. So we expect those jurisdictions to all try again next session. They've been trying for the last several years. It is likely that one of them will squeak through, as well as places like Michigan, Illinois, and Vermont. Federally, some of you might have heard that there are working groups in both the House and the Senate that are actively studying paid leave. The House in particular has been incredibly active. Representatives Houlihan and Bice have been having thought leadership sessions and meetings with various stakeholders, with carriers, large employers, small employers, employee advocates, the existing states, right, collecting data and information. They released a policy framework for federal paid leave back in January. And one of the very big focal points of that policy framework is something called the I-Plan, the Interstate Paid Leave Action Network. There's no legislation yet, but the focus of that, the core goal is harmonization of the existing patchwork of paid leave laws. We're optimistic on the prospects for the I-Plan. The American Benefits Council is playing a very large role in trying to push that initiative forward. And that's where things stand today. Sure, if I have a minute or two for questions, but thank you everyone for your time.
Hi, Carl Polzer, Center on Capital and Social Equity. I'm advocate for low-income workers, and I believe in 5 sick days for all workers, because if you want, everybody here assumes sick, they get sick leave. If you go to I used to work for the long-term care industry. If you go to one of their meetings with their workers, 25 or 30%, they have to take a pay cut to go to the doctor if they have insurance. Okay, so this lack of uniformity that you describe in sick leave laws leads us to one of 3 ERISA type conclusions. One would be total preemption, sort of it's employee benefit, it should get out. One would be a HIPAA-like floor, where the federal government would set a floor and hold harmless for employers if you do that, and let states add some things. And the other would be, you know, some kind of national standard. Totally federal. What would you prefer? I mean, where do you see? I mean, I know in the next few years we're not going there, but there seems to be momentum. What would you prefer?
Yeah, well, preference is a tricky question, right? What do I expect? I expect that the federal government could step in, right? They've been trying for a few years with the Healthy Families Act. There is Executive Order 13706, which has a paid sick leave mandate for certain contractors and subcontractors with the federal government. So they've been using that as a model to try to build paid sick leave off of that. But it doesn't seem as if there's going to be any level of preemption, right? What I would prefer is that there becomes a greater level of uniformity and consistency across the states, that they get to a point where the covered reasons, the amounts of leave, the usage characteristics, the rate of pay, that gets harmonized. I don't expect that'll happen. I think the most likely outcome is we continue with the Wild West that we have today, or we get that second option where the federal government sets a floor, but doesn't end up doing anything to preempt the states from going further up. Yeah, thanks. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Josh. That was great. Jake and I only have about 10 minutes. And while he makes his way up here, I wanted to get us started. When Jim Klein and his team at the council met with the EBRI team months ago to brainstorm what we could do together in recognition of EBRI's anniversary, we all came up with the idea of doing focus group-like meetings with employers to get their point of view on ERISA preemption. Jim and his team get the credit for pulling together about a dozen large employers, and we met with them back in February during 2 meetings. We asked them questions such as, what does ERISA preemption mean to your company as a sponsor of health benefits? Can you give examples of how ERISA preemption has allowed your company to be more innovative as a sponsor of health benefits? Can you give examples of how ERISA preemption has enabled better management of health benefit costs? What would you do differently, if anything, if ERISA preemption disappeared? Any aspects of ERISA preemption that are problematic or you wish could be changed? What is the value in continuing to offer health benefits in a traditional way instead of doing things like moving to an individual coverage health reimbursement arrangement, or private health insurance exchanges, or just dropping coverage altogether and letting your employees get coverage through the Affordable Care Act? We asked some other questions as well. The companies we could go to the next slide. The companies we talked to, not necessarily nationally representative, but they're large, and I would describe them as leaders. They would trigger a trend or set a new trend, and they were wide-ranging industries. Each firm employed at least 25,000 employees plus dependents. They had at least 500,000 covered lives and collectively spent over $6 billion on health benefits. So before I turn over to Jake to tell us more about what we learned from the conversations, I just want to thank Jim and his team. They did a lot of the heavy lifting, and the project was a lot of fun to work on. So be on the look for an issue brief from EBRI in the next month or two with our findings, and I'll turn over to Jake to tell us more about what we found.
Thanks, Paul. Excuse me. You could be the most diligent researcher, the most competent, the most thorough researcher, but there's just no substitute for the views and experiences of those with the boots on the ground. And so we learned a lot from these discussions with benefits executives at large companies. I would say that we were almost bombarded with insights, and it was no small feat to distill those insights into a white paper. But in doing so, we identified 3 main themes. The first theme that we came across on the next slide is a consistent menu of benefits and a consistent landscape of regulations. So under ERISA preemption for self-insured employers, there's a uniform landscape of regulations that employers have to adhere to. And so employers were drawn to the ability to have equal benefits regardless of where people sit. And this is becoming an increasingly important thing now that remote work is more widespread. And so this benefits equality piece was very important to employers. One had said that they have a strong desire for everybody to have equal benefits regardless of where they sit. And another had said something about the equity piece being very important to them. They wanted their employees in California and Colorado and New Jersey to all have the same benefits. If they got different benefits, that's not equal, and that's a situation that they would prefer to avoid. And another benefits executive even highlighted that they viewed ERISA preemption as lowering barriers to talent mobility. And by that, they mean, if there's an employee in Oklahoma and they get a promotion and they get a chance to move to maybe headquarters in California, the employer knows that because of ERISA preemption, that the differing benefits in different states won't be part of that decision about whether or not that person chooses to move across state lines to go work in headquarters. The second theme that we discovered was that of innovation. And namely that ERISA preemption fosters innovation. One even went so far as to say that ERISA is the path to innovation. So each employer has a different workforce with different needs. A largely blue-collar old workforce in Kentucky is going to face different issues than a young white-collar tech workforce in California. And so employers want to have the flexibility and freedom to offer benefits that that have a laser target on their particular workforces. One employer went so far as to say that going to a 50-state patchwork solution is actually the opposite of innovative, which I find pretty sympathetic. Just to add on to that, a third one said that a lot of innovation comes from point solutions that help employees live healthier and better lives. And by point solutions, they mean things like diabetes management, mental health issues, weight loss management, and those things aren't going to be relevant to every single workforce, but employers want the ability to tailor benefits that best help their workforce live healthier and better lives. And the third theme that emerged was that of the ability to offer high quality and relatively low cost health benefits. Employers called out the fact that ERISA preemption was the framework that allowed them to actually deliver high quality and relatively low cost health benefits to their workforce. And the way that they realize those savings comes in two channels. One is that employers would have to really staff up if they had to manage 50 different state benefits instead of just one uniform federal standard. So one said that they have to double their staff or hire more consultants to help manage those complexities, and those costs are going to add up and get passed along to employees. Another channel that employers realize cost savings from ERISA preemption is being able to negotiate with the same provider across state lines. So one noted that in particular on the pharmacy benefit manager side, if they had to negotiate with a different vendor in each state, that would sort of negate their ability to leverage their size to negotiate better benefits and better prices for their employees. And so when you lose that control by having to go with a number of different providers, it's going to end up costing more, and most likely those costs are going to get passed along to employees. And so, as Paul mentioned, these insights and many more form the backbone of a white paper that is forthcoming. So please be on the lookout for that in the next month or so. And now I believe I'm going to kick it back over to Paul as he and a special guest engage on a nice, cozy fireside chat on this warm and sunny 80-degree afternoon.
Okay, so my pleasure to be up here with Dr. Douglas Holtz-Eakin for this fireside chat. Dr. Holtz-Eakin is the president and founder of the American Action Forum. Doug has also served in a variety of influential policy positions, some I'm going to mention. During 2001 to 2002, he was the chief economist of the President's Council of Economic Advisors. From 2003 to 2005, he was the 6th director of the Congressional Budget Office. And it was during his tenure at CBO that CBO assisted Congress as they addressed numerous policies. I'm just going to note one. Do you know which one I'm going to note?
Medicare.
The 2003 Medicare Modernization Act.
Never goes away.
Which also gave us HSAs. And the reason why I want to mention this is because during 2003, that's when we met for the first time. I don't know if you remember this conversation either. Dallas may remember it. Dallas and I had just published a paper. It was entitled, "How Many Medicare Beneficiaries Will Lose Employment-Based Retiree Health Benefits If Medicare Covers Outpatient Prescription Drugs?" Right, quite the mouthful. And when Doug's CBO did their estimate, they came out with 31 to 37%. Dallas and I came out with 2 to 9%. And needless to say, the first thing Doug ever said to me, I think Dallas was part of this conversation too, was something like, "That paper you wrote has caused me more problems than anything I've ever had to deal with at the CBO." After Doug left the CBO, he was director of domestic and economic policy for the John McCain presidential campaign.
Not my fault.
Not your fault. And after that, he was a commissioner on the congressionally chartered Financial Crisis Inquiry Commission. So Doug, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
So we just have a little bit, we should have more than 2 minutes left though.
I've been marked to market again.
So first question, employers. I didn't think my introduction was that long. Employers complain about increasing premiums, variation in quality of medical services, the price of hospitals, price of prescription drugs, lack of transparency, and we could go on and spend the rest of the afternoon just airing grievances. Yet you think the greatest threat to health benefits is not any of those issues, nor I think public policy proposals that we've seen like single payer, but in quotes, the slow erosion of ERISA preemption at the state level. Can you talk more about your thinking behind this?
Sure. Well, first of all, thanks for talking to me again after 20 years. Um, this sort of lies at the intersection of a lot of things that are going. And so, first of all, outside of this illustrious group, not a lot of people pay attention to ERISA. Many people don't even know it's there. They don't understand what an important achievement it was 50 years ago. And so when we sort of have gone through the debates over coverage, expansion of coverage, universal coverage, Medicare for all, they're not focused on keeping the coverage we have, which is in fact the ESI coverage, which is the majority of people in the United States, and ERISA being 60-odd% of the folks in ESI. So the first thing you want to do is not lose a lot of coverage, and that's been the central debate for a while now. The second broad theme that gets my attention is that we've now shifted from a coverage debate to a cost debate. Both parties talking about cost of healthcare, focusing on particular pieces of it like drugs a lot, but more generally, ERISA was a way to get lower cost healthcare because you can take advantage of economies of scale that came up in your employer's survey. If you've got nationally traded goods and services, you should have a national market for those goods and services. ERISA provides a national market. It lowers the costs of compliance. That also came up in the employer survey. So it's central to sort of doing what you can in health plan design to keep the cost down. And then the third thing that has me concerned is that we're seeing in this area, as in many others in public policy, that policymaking is being done by the courts, and the Congress is not stepping up and saying, okay, it's been 50 years. What do we want to do? What's the direction this nation should take? And I don't like that because we're getting these piecemeal decisions that undercut the basic premise of ERISA.
Policymaking has also been happening at state level.
Yes.
Do you have any thoughts on what large employers can do to address what's happening at state level?
Well, they're already doing it. I mean, they can go in and make their case with state policymakers and state leaders and say, I think you're going to do more damage than good with this. I mean, these policymakers have the best of intentions. No one should be confused about that, but they're going to damage location decisions. And people don't think of that when they think about employee benefits. But if you don't want to have to comply with that state mandate, then the next decision might go to another state that's honoring the ERISA intent. So make the case that this is a piece of the attractive location decision that most firms have to make, and they're hurting their case.
So the employer role in providing health benefits has been debated back and forth between the left and the right. Do you have any thoughts on the value that employment-based coverage provides in the context of the entire healthcare system?
So this is a very close to home question, since I was the guy who, on behalf of John McCain, proposed blowing up employer-sponsored health insurance. That experience has made me a raging incrementalist, and it's an incredibly valuable benefit. And in the context of the health insurance system, from the sort of more conservative point of view, it is work related, and you want to have all benefits that you can be related to work and get people into the satisfaction of working and the advancement that it brings. This fits right in with that, and it is the most prominent source of coverage. It's a tool that employers use to attract high quality workforces. All of that's true, and I think the public is not willing to leap into something new until they're convinced that it works, and so they're sold on the employer-sponsored insurance system.
So there will be time for questions. So think about what you might want to ask Doug related to your, would you say, raging incrementalist?
Yes.
The tax treatment of health benefits has come under attack, both from the left and the right. And economists have argued that it's inflationary, it's inefficient, and regressive, which is one reason why many were against repealing the Cadillac tax. I think at the time you also supported, you were also against repealing the Cadillac tax. How have your thoughts about that have changed, whether it's in an incremental way or a non-incremental way?
So the Cadillac tax was just a disguised way of repealing the exemption from tax of ESI, or capping the exemption or any number of those things. I still have a belief that we ought to think about doing that in the following sense. The federal government subsidizes every piece of health insurance. It subsidizes ESI, it subsidizes the ACA, it subsidizes Medicaid, it subsidizes Medicare, veterans, TRICARE. Everywhere you look, there's a subsidy, and it's the most uncoordinated, inefficient set of subsidies that you could imagine. I mean, so we throw some money in the ACA, do better premium tax credits, pull people out of the small group market and employers, and then they go away and they go back to the other one. And so I would like to see that set of subsidies rationalized. You may or may not have noticed that we have some budget problems on the horizon, and there is going to be an increasing need to spend our taxpayer dollars more wisely, and rationalizing those subsidies would be part of it. That would probably mean capping for high-income individuals the exemption for ESR.
So we heard, I don't know if you were here this morning, but the opening panel had mentioned some of the people in Congress that were part of, when ERISA passed, Jacob Javits and others. Do you see anyone up on the Hill who could be a champion for ERISA?
Well, we've had hearings on this, so it's not that it hasn't gotten noticed in the committees of jurisdiction. I think that's the natural place to look. This has not been a policy-heavy Congress, and with age comes a little restraint.
You're not trying to be funny, right?
Yeah, so I'm hoping next Congress, we get a little more momentum on the policy front.
So a couple of years ago, there was a survey of large employers which found that 86% expected the government will be required to intervene to provide coverage and contain costs. And I was kind of astounded by this finding that 85% are looking to the federal government to intervene on coverage and costs. And when Jake and I talked to many large employers about it, we pushed them to be specific, even though they weren't necessarily part of that survey, but to be specific about, what they could get behind. And the only thing that came out of that discussion was government regulation of prescription drugs. It's the only thing anybody could think of off the cuff without it being given a list. I'm not surprised that the cost of specialty medications and gene therapy are keeping employers up at night. You've got traditional PBMs, the more transparent PBMs are around now, and now Mark Cuban has a business that has started working with employers. Do you have any thoughts on how to create a more viable free market and what might have the most influence in this space?
I don't have any that I'm going to pretend are so close to the finish line we can just push them over and have big success. This has been this is something I've spent the past 20 years on with not a great amount of success, to be honest. One of the things I would love to see is for the various private sector players to stop appealing to the government to get that other guy and instead get together and come up with some private sector solutions. I think it's long past time when the PBMs and the manufacturers and the insurers sat down and figured out how they're going to cover specialty drugs and some very narrow, very expensive, right now, oncology and increasingly other kinds of medications. And the reality is that the drugs have taken all the oxygen out of the room, and the bulk of the money is still spent on hospitals and docs. And we have to get our hands around the whole problem and not just the rifle shot.
Okay. Last question, and I'm going to open it up to all of you for a few minutes. Large group market works fairly well at providing health benefits, but small group market has its challenges: lower offer rates, higher rates of uninsured, among other things, affordability. Anything you can say from your days at CBO or now about, what we might be able to do to improve the small group market?
I think, the problem with the small group market is it's small, and anything that gets you enhanced pooling ability makes it bigger is the route. And it's also not a particularly knowledgeable crowd. You talk to the folks in the big employers, they have benefits managers and they have consultants, and they're well versed, they know their options, they shop well. I think we have to somehow really help the small business flags with an education campaign on providing better.
We have time for 2 or 3 questions. There are mics floating around. If anyone has a question, please raise your hand and we'll get a microphone over to you.
Hello? There it is. Thanks, guys, for the good discussion. I agree, Doug, what you just mentioned about like, it's not just about going out and getting the other guy, but finding solutions. And us as employers have to be willing. Sometimes we're not very good at change and actually stepping up and say, there are actually solutions out there and we're going to utilize them because we're tired of the status quo. I think we can all do a better job at that. The one thing I will say, though, I think is that will help with that and infuse some of that is continuing the transparency work. Like, good start. We need more of it, particularly on quality transparency. Like, I'm continually frustrated when we go to some of our partners and ask for quality transparency on things like, who's the top quality doctors? Don't tell me about the system level. Tell me at the individual doc level and getting that. And so I think that could create more of a market, a freer open exchange of market where we can feel good about. If we had transparency, we could make better choices. What are your thoughts on that?
So everyone should like to have transparency in the sense of knowing what you're buying at what price and being able to comparison shop and all that. I get nervous about the transparency discussion when it moves into the legislative arena because it's often opening private contracts, which I am not a big fan of. There is the sanctity of private contracts. I think it's an important part of the free enterprise system, and we have become a little bit cavalier about that. So that's a concern about where that goes. The quality thing is a particular frustration. We are now overwhelmed with quality metrics. We have so many quality metrics, we have no idea who's any good. And there has to be an effort to sort of find a very simple set of metrics, some of which are outcome metrics, some of which are process metrics. Make that list short enough that a real person can read it and disseminate it widely. That's missing somehow. Yeah.
I think we have time for one. We could squeeze one more question if there are any. Okay, well, thank you so much, Doug. Really
Thank you.
appreciate you being here. So it's about 2:15, just in time for our afternoon break. I just want to thank all of our speakers for their thoughtful insight and participation. Thank all of you here in person and everyone attending online. Just a few instructions as we go into the break. The live stream is going to conclude. We appreciate everyone's online participation, and we will be sending out to everyone in a day or so the link to view our live streamed event.